Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little scandalous, a little strange, and deeply soaked in history. You're about to time travel back to the Middle Ages, when the church wasn't just telling you how to pray, but when to have sex, or more accurately, when not to. Spoiler alert, it's more than half the year. That's right, according to religious law, there were more forbidden days than permitted ones, and violating those restrictions could earn you public shame, a hefty penance, or even a lifetime of spiritual anxiety. If you're hoping to survive this era with your sanity and libido intact, you probably won't. Not entirely. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes open in a flickering candlelit room. The air smells of beeswax and musty parchment. Outside the stone walls, church bells ring out the hour. You're living in a village somewhere in 13th century Europe, where the church's influence stretches from the pulpit to your pantry, and yes, even into your bed. You haven't even kissed your betrothed yet, and already the local priest is making it known that certain things are not allowed. Not on Sundays, not during Lent, not during Advent. Not on the eve of a feast day, not if you're menstruating, not if you just ate garlic, and definitely not if it's a Wednesday. The list goes on. At first it seems laughable, until you realise how meticulously the church has mapped this moral minefield. Every parish, every bishop, every devout household clings to a shared assumption, that your body is a dangerous vessel, capable of dragging your soul into hell with a single poorly timed thrust. You wonder how anyone ever managed to reproduce, let alone enjoy themselves. It's like living with a spiritual traffic cop permanently stationed in your bedroom, blowing a whistle every time you reach for your partner. The core of it all lies in a fascinating and restrictive idea that pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, distracts from divine love. The church didn't invent abstinence, but it weaponized it, following early Christian ascetics and theologians like Augustine, who famously wrote about how the flesh wars against the spirit. Medieval clergy began preaching that physical intimacy, even within marriage, was at best a necessary evil, and at worst, a sin in disguise. That leads you to the unwelcome discovery of a literal book of do's and don'ts, penitentials. These were guidebooks used by confessors to assign punishments for various sins. They didn't just outline major crimes like theft or murder, they broke down specific sexual acts, and complete with detailed calendars of when they were prohibited. Some listed over 100 forbidden days annually. Others were more generous, only 60 or 70. Imagine flipping through a leather-bound tome to find out whether tonight was holy or horny. Here's a quirky little gem. Some penitentials even banned sex during thunderstorms. Why? Because the belief was that the devil, not the clouds, stirred up storms, and committing acts of lust during such demonic weather could result in monstrous children or worse, divine punishment. Yes, even Mother Nature could cock-block you. At the heart of this tension lies a constant scholarly debate that still isn't fully resolved. Was the church truly obsessed with repression, or were these rules more about setting a cultural tone than actually being enforced? Some historians argue that the clergy never really expected everyone to follow all the bans. They were aspirational guidelines, like New Year's resolutions you make with every intention of breaking. Others insist that these restrictions were taken very seriously, especially in monastic circles, where violating sexual taboos could lead to exile or excommunication. Still, not everything was doom and gloom. You start to notice a quiet, almost humorous resistance among villagers. A knowing wink between spouses, a sudden uptick in grain storage visits late at night. People weren't saints after all, and behind closed shutters, they found ways to navigate the strict calendar. You hear tales of couples who deliberately miscounted the days of Lent, or conveniently forgot that it was a minor saint's day. There's even the odd story of a priest who gently looked the other way, possibly out of mercy, possibly out of shared hypocrisy. The deeper you settle into this medieval life, the more you sense how bizarre it is that your bedroom behaviour is tracked with the same solemnity as confession or communion. There's something deeply unsettling and darkly funny about needing divine permission for intimacy. But for all its absurdity, this wasn't just about prudishness. It was about control. By inserting itself into your most private acts, the church asserted its dominance over the whole person, mind, body, and soul. And yet, it doesn't work. You begin to feel the slow-burning tension building between dogma and desire. You're not alone. You're just one villager in a long unspoken rebellion that's already brewing. The calendar hangs heavy over your life. Not that you own one, really. Most people in your village can't read, let alone track dates with any precision. But the rhythm of holy days, fasts, vigils, and feasts is as regular and intrusive as the sunrise. You don't need parchment to know what time of year it is. You know it by the silence in bed, by how your spouse sighs when they roll over and remember it's one of those days. Welcome to the calendar of sin. You start learning the rules early, probably from a well-meaning elder or a stern-faced priest. The church's logic feels like a long, slow labyrinth. You can't have sex on Sundays, because it's the Lord's Day. Fridays are off limits in remembrance of Christ's crucifixion. Saturdays are the eve of Sunday, so no-go. Wednesdays, a midweek day of penance. That already knocks out over half the week. And then come the major liturgical seasons, Lent, Advent, Rogation Days, Ember Days, the 12 days of Christmas, and assorted saints' feast days, all sprinkled generously through the year like salt on cold porridge. If you do the math, and trust us, some medieval monks absolutely did, you're left with maybe 100 safe days in a year. That's if you're lucky. And it's not like you can just let loose on those greenlit days either. There are still rules. No sex during menstruation, no intimacy during pregnancy, no touching for 40 days after childbirth, no morning rendezvous before Mass, no encounters before communion, no sex if you've recently fought, cursed, eaten too much, or, heaven forbid, had wine. It's a miracle anyone reproduced at all. You hear this all laid out at Mass, cloaked in Latin and stern warnings, but you really feel it when your local priest visits your home to check in. He's not exactly inspecting the bedding, but you get the sense he knows more than he lets on. The church might not have eyes in your bedroom, but your neighbours do, and they gossip in the confessional. Whispered rumours of pregnancies that shouldn't have happened when they did. Marriages that seem just a little too affectionate during Lent. You start to understand that the spiritual calendar isn't just a set of rules, it's a surveillance system, cloaked in ritual and incense. One particularly haunting moment comes during a sermon when the priest reads from a local penitential. It's a small, handwritten book, likely copied by a bored monk decades ago. Inside, it lists forbidden acts and their punishments. For example, he who copulates with his wife on a feast day shall do penance for 10 days on bread and water. Another passage warns of the sin of flesh committed within the sacred octave, resulting in 40 days of penance and possible exclusion from communion. The specificity is almost comical, until you realise how many days fall into one sacred octave or another. And then you learn about Lent, the crown jewel of sexual prohibition. 40 days of fasting, prayer, and yes, abstinence. But it's not just Lent. Advent, the period leading up to Christmas, carries similar restrictions, though slightly less severe. There's also the lesser-known Ember Days, 4 sets of 3 days scattered throughout the year when believers are expected to fast and refrain from sex. Some areas even consider the entire week after Easter off-limits, turning Christ's resurrection into a celibate celebration. Here's a weird, fringe detail that slips through the cracks. Some people believed that having sex on forbidden days would produce children with physical deformities or mental disabilities. The logic. God marked the child with shame for the parent's disobedience. That fear, irrational as it seems today, was powerful and persistent. Parents whispered these superstitions like ancient warnings. The idea that a lustful moment could lead to a marked child was enough to terrify young couples into towing the ecclesiastical line. But scholars today are divided on just how seriously these rules were followed. Some argue that most of these taboos were more theoretical than enforced, existing primarily in clergy manuals and not in daily life. Others believe the fear of divine punishment, combined with social pressure, was strong enough to keep people mostly in line. There's no clear answer, because records are patchy and personal behaviour doesn't leave neat historical footprints. What we do know is that these restrictions were widespread, deeply embedded and often internalised. People confessed to breaking them, which means, of course, that people were breaking them. And here's where it starts to wear on you. You begin to notice how unnatural the rhythm of the calendar feels, how forced the abstinence becomes. You and your partner may share a deep bond, but that bond is put on pause again and again by invisible hands. And the irony? These same hands are preaching the holiness of marriage, the sacred duty to be fruitful and multiply. The math just doesn't add up. So what do people do? They get creative, they rationalise, they miscount the calendar. Some families quietly ignore Advent restrictions and hope no one notices. Others time their intimacy just after sunset, technically shifting it to the next day. There's even a not-so-subtle practice of confess first, do later, a reverse loophole that lets people sin with a semi-clear conscience. One thing's certain, you're not alone in your skepticism. The more you live under this calendar, the more you realise that medieval life is a performance, a balancing act between devout appearances and very human desires. And while the church may claim authority over your nights, your dreams, your body and your soul, not everyone is buying it. You feel it in the air even before Lent begins. It creeps into daily conversation, thick and solemn like the scent of incense clinging to your clothes after Mass. The priest preaches a little more loudly, the bell tolls a little more slowly, and your neighbours suddenly start giving you those quiet, complicit glances, as if to say, yep, it's that time again. You're about to enter 40 days of what feels like spiritual boot camp. Welcome to the ultimate annual shutdown, Lent, where the church doesn't just take away your meat and your music, it takes away your sex life too. You and your partner know what's coming. You've been married long enough to understand how this works, but that doesn't make it any easier. You spend Shrove Tuesday indulging, feasting on pancakes and whatever scraps of salted pork are left, because Ash Wednesday marks the beginning of abstinence, and not just from food. The term fasting covers more than stomachs. It's a full-body discipline. Sexual activity is strictly forbidden throughout the Lenten season, from the first ashes rubbed on your forehead to the triumphant Alleluia on Easter morning. That's 40 nights, plus Sundays, which are technically feast days but still frowned upon for anything beyond prayer and sleep. The priest spells it out in no uncertain terms during his sermon. The body must be tamed, he says, the passions crucified. He leans on a favourite metaphor, that lust is a wild beast, and Lent is the leash. The idea isn't just to avoid sin, it's to become holier by resisting even what's allowed at other times. You're supposed to embrace the discomfort, offer it up as spiritual sacrifice. But as the weeks drag on, you begin to feel less like a holy warrior and more like a married monk. Your bed becomes a battleground, not for temptation. No, you've both resigned yourselves to celibacy for now, but for sleep. You lie next to each other awkwardly, trying not to touch too much, turning away from the warm body that once brought you comfort. It feels unnatural, and that's the point. The church wants it to feel unnatural. If holiness were easy, it wouldn't be valuable. And Lent is all about testing limits, bodily, emotional, even marital. Of course, not everyone obeys. One neighbour whispers over the communal bread oven that her cousin in the next village still sleeps with her husband during Lent, but makes sure to confess before Easter. Another man boasts that he and his wife avoid the sin by choosing non-procreative positions, a loophole that's questionable at best and heretical at worst. You realise pretty quickly that for all the rules, people are inventing their own moral math. Sin plus confession equals forgiveness, right? Especially if you're quick with your penance. There's an unsettling fringe belief you encounter one evening over ale and dried figs, that children conceived during Lent are cursed. Some say they'll be born blind, others that they'll have crooked limbs or be more prone to demonic possession. One old man claims Lent-born babies cry endlessly through the night because they carry their parents' guilt inside them. It sounds ridiculous, until you remember that even learned scholars once claimed that a child could be marked by the moon phase or the mother's cravings. In this world, shame takes on flesh. Here's where things get darker. The Church's teachings often borrow from earlier Roman or even pagan ideas about bodily control and spiritual purity, but twist them into something more binding. You learn that in some regions, couples who admitted to sex during Lent were required to do penance not just privately, but publicly. Imagine kneeling at the church steps wrapped in sackcloth as others filed past you to receive the Eucharist. Everyone knows why you're there. You weren't strong enough. You let the flesh win. And it's not just the peasants getting scolded. Monastic records from the period show that even monks and nuns occasionally violated their vows of celibacy, and those infractions during Lent were punished especially harshly. In one famous case, a monk who was caught in the act was chained to the altar and forced to fast on bread and water until Easter. He nearly died. The idea was to literally starve the sin out of him. But this kind of severity raises a lingering scholarly debate. Were people really as obsessed with Lent's sexual restrictions as the Church made it seem? Or was it mostly the clergy projecting their own fears, their own ideals, onto the laity? Some argue that rural communities treated Lent more like a diet than a vow of celibacy, that the public sermons and penitentials were more bark than bite. Others suggest that internal guilt, even without external enforcement, was punishment enough. You start to see signs of quiet protest. A couple in your village mysteriously leaves town for a few weeks each spring, just after Ash Wednesday. When they return, they seem more relaxed. No one asks questions. Another neighbour times her pregnancies very precisely and always seems to conceive just before or just after Lent. Coincidence? Possibly. Clever planning? Definitely. People are starting to find the edges of the law and press against them, softly, quietly, like fingers tracing the grain of forbidden wood. As Lent drags on, so does your frustration. You're not just avoiding temptation anymore, you're resenting it. And that resentment starts to feel, ironically, like its own kind of sin. You want to be devout, you want to follow the rules, but you're human, and so is your partner. The Church tells you that this discipline will bring you closer to God, but what about the distance it's creating between the two of you? Then Easter arrives. Finally. The bells ring, the incense floods the air, and people shout, "Christ is risen," with genuine relief. But for many, that resurrection isn't just spiritual, it's physical. Marriages rekindle, intimacy resumes. There's even a slightly risque tradition in some villages called the Easter Cuddle, where couples are encouraged to spend the night together, as a symbol of fertility, of spring's rebirth, of divine joy in union. A not-so-subtle compensation for 40 nights of spiritual drought. You sigh, feeling the familiar warmth of your partner's hand again, unburdened by the weight of the calendar, for now. But you also know, Advent's only 8 months away. You don't get much of a break. Just when you think you've made it through the long cold slog of Lent and emerged back into the warmth of spring and sanctioned intimacy, the calendar reminds you there's another round coming, Advent. And while it might be the softer cousin of Lent, less intense, less dramatic, fewer days, don't be fooled. The message is the same. Shut it down. Zip it up. Love God more than your spouse. The Church has spoken. Advent creeps in just as the nights grow long and the air gets bitingly cold. Winter settles into your bones, and with it comes the expectation of restraint. Not just from rich food and drunken merrymaking, but from each other. You're supposed to be preparing for the birth of Christ, not, as the Church made painfully clear, creating new life of your own. The irony doesn't escape you. You're celebrating a miraculous birth by avoiding the act that causes it. But logic isn't exactly the currency of the season. Piety is. Once again, sermons shift their tone. There's talk of purity, of anticipation, of sacred waiting. You're told to focus on prayer and reflection. And once again, the bed becomes a quieter place. You and your partner don't even discuss it this time. It's just understood. The rhythm of your marriage isn't dictated by desire anymore, but by liturgical obligation. But here's where Advent gets even trickier than Lent. It's shorter, yes, but it overlaps with festivals and local customs that do celebrate life and joy. In some regions, the Feast of St. Nicholas involves gift-giving and parties. The Feast of the Immaculate Conception honours the Virgin Mary with song and procession. And let's not forget the 12 days of Christmas, which kick off on December 25th and run straight into the new year. Those days blur the lines between sacred and secular. So what are you supposed to do? Abstain until Epiphany? That's over a month. People start to get a little fuzzy with their obedience, and they start getting creative. In some parts of Europe, local customs begin to push back, subtly, almost sweetly, against the Church's grip. You hear stories of couples exchanging secret tokens during Advent, little love charms or fertility symbols wrapped in ribbon. There are songs sung in quiet dialects, full of double meanings and coy references. Some believe that conceiving a child during the darkest part of the year, especially near the solstice, is actually a sign of favour from nature, not sin. It's the earth reclaiming its rhythms from the cold hands of the clergy. Still, for every quiet rebellion, there's an equally loud warning. One bizarre fringe belief that spreads during this time is that the devil walks the earth more freely during Advent, particularly on long dark nights when people are tempted to seek comfort in each other. The story goes that Satan can slip between the sheets unseen, hitching a ride on desire like a parasite. Some penitentials even describe what happens when couples ignore the ban. Children born from these unions are not just spiritually flawed, they are cursed, marked by a wandering demon. Sounds like ghost story nonsense, but in a time when people still believe in witches and werewolves, it's more than enough to keep some households compliant. You begin to wonder how much of this is truly about faith, and how much is about fear. That's a question scholars still wrestle with. Some argue that Advent's restrictions were never as harshly enforced as Lent's, and that most priests turned a blind eye to minor violations. Others insist that Advent was taken just as seriously in many regions, especially as Christmas gained prominence. The truth is likely somewhere in between, buried under centuries of oral tradition and inconsistent enforcement. After all, enforcement depended heavily on the mood of the local clergy, and their own ability to resist temptation. In your own village, the mood is cautious. You see fewer couples walking hand in hand during the season. The tavern is quieter at night. There's a strange sense of suspended animation, as though everyone is waiting not just for Christ, but for permission to feel close again. When people do talk, it's often about the coming feast, about roasts and puddings and fresh bread. No one says it out loud, but you get the sense they're also looking forward to being able to touch again. To climb back into bed without counting days or second-guessing kisses. One snowy evening, you overhear an argument between a young couple near the well. The woman accuses the man of trying to pressure her, of disrespecting the season. He responds that God surely wouldn't punish two people in love, especially married ones. She starts to cry. It's awkward and raw, and you realise that beneath the layer of religious duty, these rules are straining real human relationships. It's not just about doctrine, it's about the daily push and pull of guilt, desire, obligation, and disappointment. Yet even with all the restrictions, babies are still born in late summer and early autumn, right on schedule for conception during Advent, which means people are doing it, quietly, secretly, maybe even joyfully, and some priests, they're looking the other way. You catch wind of one who simply instructs couples to confess it later, so long as it was loving. Not all clergy are iron-fisted moralists. Some are just as conflicted as you, and while it's easy to roll your eyes at the absurdity of it all, sex bans based on calendars, demons hitchhiking on desire, you start to realise something bigger. This isn't just about suppression, it's about control. The church isn't merely policing behaviour, it's mapping your time, carving up your calendar, embedding itself into your routine so deeply that you can't separate faith from daily life. And the most effective tool? Guilt. Guilt that's quiet, invisible, self-regenerating. You don't even need a priest in the room anymore. The voice is already in your head. Still, you and your partner steal a moment one night, tucked under thick woolen blankets as the wind howls outside. No words, just warmth. A quiet, fleeting rebellion against a system that says love must wait. You don't know if it counts as a sin. You just know it feels like peace. You'd think, after all the lectures and rules and seasonal shutdowns, the church would at least give couples their wedding night. Like, surely there's some kind of honeymoon exemption, right? Wrong. You learn this the hard way, or rather, by watching someone else go through it. It's midsummer, and the village chapel is decked out with garlands and flower petals for a local wedding. Everyone's gathered, smiling politely, but the atmosphere's a little tense. Because it turns out the ceremony happens to fall right in the middle of a holy season, and the priest has made it very clear, consummation will have to wait. Imagine that. You've waited months, or years, to marry. You've done everything right. No sneaking around, no touching, not even too much time spent alone together. And now, on the night you're finally bound in holy matrimony, you're told to sleep side by side and do absolutely nothing. The church doesn't just believe in self-control, it believes in delayed gratification on a truly theological level. The idea is that marriage is a sacrament, and consummation during a forbidden time like Lent or Advent or a saint's feast, can stain that sacrament before it even takes root. You see the couple later sitting awkwardly by the hearth while the rest of the village drinks and dances. They're polite, they smile, but there's a tension in their posture you can't unsee. It's the kind of tension born from an expectation denied, and it's not uncommon. In fact, depending on where you are in medieval Europe, the church could recommend as many as 3 days of abstinence after the wedding, just to honour saints or fasts or cleanse the body before union. Because apparently, waiting until the wedding wasn't virtuous enough. This wasn't limited to unlucky couples whose weddings fell during sacred seasons. Even a Tuesday wedding might come with strings attached. If the next day's a feast day, say St. Michael's or St. Agnes's, you're out of luck again. And then there's the wedding time. You were encouraged to marry in the morning, attend Mass immediately after, and then not engage in anything physical until after you'd prayed together and fasted. A quickie before brunch. Not exactly canonically approved. One fringe belief you come across while flipping through a musty old book in the manor library is particularly grim. That if you consummated your marriage on a holy day, your firstborn might be stillborn or suffer a tragic fate. A superstition? Definitely. But enough to haunt the thoughts of a young bride staring into the rafters of a cold, quiet bedchamber, wondering if just holding hands would damn her future children. It sounds extreme, until you remember how many lives were already lost in childbirth. Blame was always searching for a home, and bad timing was as good a scapegoat as any. Modern scholars are still squabbling over this. Did the church really expect couples to abstain on their wedding night? Or was this more like a pious suggestion that few took seriously? Records are scarce. But personal letters and confessionals hint that many couples simply ignored the rule, especially in rural areas where the priest lived far away and had more pressing concerns than your post-nuptial activities. But in cities and abbey-dominated towns, the pressure was real. Some couples even confessed just hours after their first night together, ashamed that they hadn't waited the extra day. The fear of spiritual taint lingered like smoke after a candle's been snuffed. You begin to see how deep this rabbit hole goes, because it's not just about sin, it's about scheduling. The church doesn't just govern your morals, it governs your calendar, and by extension, your impulses, your relationships, your milestones. Marriage isn't just a personal vow, it's a public, regulated event with multiple levels of compliance. Think of it less like a wedding, and more like an ecclesiastical permit to touch each other with blackout dates. Hear one of the older women in your village mutter that it used to be worse, that in her mother's time there was a bishop who wouldn't allow weddings during Lent at all, period. You'd have to wait until after Easter. Imagine being engaged, ready, and just stuck. And yes, that led to predictable consequences. A few too many premature babies born in December, followed by scandal, confession, and community whispering. The church claimed it was guarding virtue, but sometimes it was just setting people up to fail. But not everyone took it lying down, well, metaphorically. You begin to notice a pattern. Some couples plan around the rules like strategists in a theological board game. One pair marries on a Thursday and ensures their first night is Friday, not because they're impatient, but because they know Saturday is off limits, and Sunday even more so. They maximise the short window between sacred restrictions. Another couple secretly weds in the woods, without a priest, just to dodge the moral constraints. It's technically invalid, but they return after a week of penitential absence, and no one asks questions. A local tale begins to circulate about a clever merchant who scheduled his wedding for the day after Pentecost, intentionally timing the consummation to align with a fertile moon and avoiding all major feast days. His wife bore twins 9 months later, and he claimed it was divine blessing for his planning. The priest frowned, but the town cheered. People love a loophole artist, especially when love's on the line, but perhaps the saddest thing you see is a couple who actually obeys all the rules. They're quiet, devout, and thoroughly exhausted. Years into marriage, they've had 3 children, but long gaps between them. They followed the church calendar to the letter, abstaining through every fast and vigil. And now, their marriage feels more like a shared prayer than a partnership. Intimacy has become a duty, something sandwiched between feast days and fasting schedules. They aren't miserable, but they aren't exactly radiant either. They're living proof of obedience, and a cautionary tale about what happens when doctrine supersedes desire. By the end of that summer, you've stopped asking whether the rules make sense. That ship sailed long ago. Now you're just wondering how people managed to keep loving each other inside such a tightly wound system. The church might have had dominion over time, but desire, that's a trickier beast. It doesn't read calendars, it doesn't obey bells, and it definitely doesn't wait for Easter. There's a strange sort of rhythm to your week now, but not the kind you'd expect. It's not driven by your workload or the changing weather, not even by the shifting moods of your partner or the hunger in your belly. No, it's the days themselves. The church has taken them hostage, and not in the fun, thank God it's Sunday kind of way. More like, you shall not touch your spouse on Friday or Saturday or Sunday or Wednesday either, depending on who's interpreting things. Welcome to the unsexy tyranny of the 7-day week. You wake up Monday and feel almost relieved. It's one of the only neutral days left. No major holy significance, no well-known fast, no commemorative martyrdom. Just a boring, morally beige Monday. You could theoretically enjoy intimacy today without earning yourself a lecture or a penance. But by the time Wednesday arrives, the restrictions begin to stack up. In many traditions, Wednesday is a day of remembrance for Judas's betrayal, a sombre pause in the middle of the week. That makes it a poor day for indulging carnal pleasures. The same goes for Friday, which commemorates Christ's crucifixion. And Saturday. That one gets a little confusing. In some places, it's considered a vigil for Sunday, a time for purification and preparation. And Sunday itself, that's the Lord's Day. Set it aside, not for each other but for Him. So let's tally that. Monday and Tuesday, maybe fair game. Thursday, questionable. Wednesday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, no-go, depending on how strict your local clergy is. That leaves you with, at best, 3 solid days a week to live like a married couple. And that's if you haven't just eaten too much, aren't preparing for mass, aren't menstruating, pregnant or postpartum. Basically, you're running a moral obstacle course, blindfolded, with a stopwatch ticking. You overhear someone joking about this at the public oven. A farmer grumbling that he needs to keep a second calendar just to figure out when it's legal to sleep with his wife. Everyone chuckles, but it's the kind of laugh that carries weight. It's not just a joke, it's daily life. These rules worm their way into your habits until you start hesitating, even on the days that are technically allowed. Guilt becomes muscle memory. What's even weirder is that the reasons behind these weekday bans are all over the place. Wednesday and Friday restrictions come from early Christian fasting traditions, meant to honour suffering and sacrifice. Saturday's purity rule is often traced back to early Jewish customs absorbed into Christian liturgy. Sunday is self-explanatory. Christ's resurrection, the holiest day of the week. But none of this is exactly spelled out in Scripture. It's all layers of custom, clerical opinion, and regional variation piled on top of each other until people just stop asking why and start asking when. And because we're in medieval Europe, nothing is simple. One region's relaxed. Thursday is another's sacred fast. In one area, priests might casually tell couples to just be respectful. In another, a sniffy bishop is handing out penances like candy for anyone who doesn't follow the full weekly abstinence model. And then there are the monastic rulebooks. The Benedictines, Cistercians, and Augustinians all had their own ideas about when sex was acceptable for married couples. Hint, rarely. Here's a quirky little gem you stumble across in an old abbey manuscript. One 12th century monk described Thursdays as a day when demons whisper in the ears of men. He insisted that lust was more potent on Thursdays, and thus advised against intimacy. No one else seems to have adopted this theory widely, but it lingers as a strange footnote in the already chaotic scheduling of acceptable intimacy. Some historians argue that all of this wasn't necessarily intended to ruin anyone's marriage, but to help redirect passion toward God. By stripping away spontaneity and forcing couples to wait, the Church hoped to reframe sexuality as a sacred duty, not a self-indulgent pastime. It's like spiritual portion control. You can have it, but in the right amount at the right time with the right attitude. And never just because you feel like it. But others point out that this is an inherently flawed approach to human nature. Passion isn't a faucet you turn on and off. Relationships aren't liturgical schedules, and people, being people, start finding workarounds. Some couples begin treating Mondays and Tuesdays like secret holidays, making the most of those unspoken windows before the week's holy shadow creeps in. Others become bolder, ignoring the rules altogether and simply avoiding confession. And a few, well, they just go nocturnal. If Sunday ends at sundown, and Monday begins technically at twilight, then surely a late-night cuddle on Sunday evening doesn't really break the rules, right? It's a game, a quiet, deeply personal game of tiptoe theology, and it reveals the strange truth that medieval people weren't just passive rule followers. They navigated these restrictions with subtlety, creativity, and sometimes outright defiance. There's a resilience to it. A low-key rebellion that lives in whispered jokes and sideways glances. You notice something else too. For all the restrictions, the church doesn't always enforce them consistently. Confessors might ask awkwardly specific questions, but they also often assign fairly light penances, a few days of prayer, bread and water meals, maybe a pilgrimage if it's especially scandalous. Rarely is anyone truly shunned for breaking the weekday code. It's more about control than punishment. The church didn't need to drag you through the streets. It just needed to make sure you felt the weight of disobedience. That said, there are occasional horror stories. You hear of a couple in a nearby village who openly flouted the rules and became a kind of cautionary tale. She conceived during Holy Week. The child died within days, and though it was likely disease, the locals whispered it was divine retribution. The couple was forced to do public penance, crawling to the church door on their knees while singing psalms. Whether that spectacle was for the child or for the community is anyone's guess. You lie awake one Wednesday night, staring at the thatched ceiling, wondering how something so natural, so ordinary became such a calculated act. You're not even thinking about sex in a passionate way anymore. It's become ritualized, commodified, turned into a holy check-in system. Are you pure today? Is this a permitted hour? Did you fast first? Did you wait long enough? The questions wrap around your thoughts like vines. And maybe that's the point. Because if the church can colonize your week, if it can transform your calendar into a sacred topography, it doesn't need to barge into your house to control you. It just needs you to check the date. By now, you've memorized the rhythm of repression. Feast, fast, Wednesday. No, Sunday, forget it. Lent, don't even try. You've internalized the calendar. But the church isn't done with you yet. Not by a long shot. Because while married couples are tangled in the ever-shifting schedule of permitted passion, there's another kind of sin that lurks in the shadows. One that doesn't require a partner at all. One that, in the eyes of medieval moralists, might just be the most dangerous of them all. The sin of solitude. The sin of solace. The solo act. Let's be real. People didn't magically become asexual just because the church said don't. And when the endless list of forbidden days made intimacy with a partner nearly impossible, well, human nature didn't exactly shut off like a lantern, but the church saw that, anticipated it, and tried to crush it before it could gain momentum. Masturbation, they said, wasn't just a sin, it was an affront to God's design, a misuse of the body, and a kind of spiritual suicide. And unlike marital sex, which could at least be justified by procreation, solo pleasure had no such loophole. It was entirely self-focused, entirely carnal, entirely damnable. The sermons didn't mince words. Some described self-pleasure as a form of self-defilement more foul than fornication. Others warned of invisible demons lurking near the bed, eager to tempt the lonely or the restless. One priest even claimed that masturbation opened the door for Satan to enter the soul through the flesh. It wasn't just about lust, it was about spiritual vulnerability. Doing it alone made you more susceptible to sin, more distant from God, and, if you believe some particularly theatrical texts, a magnet for demonic possession. You discover that confession manuals were obsessed with this topic. They included entire sections just for it, with detailed questions like, "Hast thou ever laid with thyself as thou would with thy wife?" Or, "Didst thou spill thy seed in solitude, thinking of women or other unnatural fantasies?" The language was specific, graphic, uncomfortable, and entirely one-sided. There was no sense of compassion or curiosity, just condemnation. In one dusty copy of a penitential found in the Abbey archives, you come across this gem: "He who commits solitary defilement shall fast for 40 days, eat no meat, and sleep without fire." That last part really hits you. Sleep without fire? In winter? That's more than punishment. It's cruelty with a theological bow on it. The implication is clear. If you seek warmth in yourself, the church will make you cold. And then there's the fringe law, the really bizarre stuff. A popular superstition in some corners of Europe claimed that angels recorded every instance of self-pleasure in a celestial book, and that on Judgment Day, your sins would be read aloud in front of the entire heavenly court. Imagine that. Standing before the throne of God as your angel flips through a divine ledger and recites every time you got handsy. That alone could keep a person celibate for life, or at least very, very nervous. One especially wild myth comes from an old Cistercian chronicle. It tells of a monk who committed the sin so often that his hand withered and fell off in the night. Another tells of a peasant who was swallowed by the earth after committing the act near a sacred spring. These stories weren't just cautionary tales, they were tools. Tools used to scare people into suppressing something that didn't need suppressing in the first place. But, as always, people found ways around it. Some monks tied their hands with rope before bed, others slept in cold water basins or on stone floors to prevent temptation. One particularly devout group reportedly placed thorny vines beneath their bed covers. Imagine that, preparing to sleep each night by setting up a physical trap for your own body. It sounds absurd, but to them, it was the price of holiness. Outside the monasteries, things were a little murkier. Among the laity, it's hard to know how much self-policing really happened. There were no surveillance cameras, no spiritual drones circling overhead. But guilt was everywhere. Even if no one saw you, you thought someone did. Or worse, that God did. And that internal tension, you feel it slowly suffocating the mind. Like a hand not gripping your flesh, but your thoughts. What's fascinating is how unevenly this was treated across gender lines. Men were warned of the spiritual and physical decay that would come from overindulgence, blindness, weakness, madness. Women, on the other hand, were often left out of the conversation entirely, not because the church thought they were immune, but because female desire was either ignored or framed as inherently demonic. When it was acknowledged, it came cloaked in misogyny. A woman who sought pleasure alone was considered doubly sinful, not just lustful, but disobedient to male authority. You weren't just sinning, you were stepping out of a line. Scholars today argue over whether these solo prohibitions were taken as seriously in daily life as the texts suggest. Some believe the church exaggerated the issue, projecting anxiety over bodily control onto the masses. Others argue that internalized guilt was so widespread that even unconfessed acts weighed heavily on the conscience. And there's the third camp, the quiet, often unrecorded reality that people sinned and simply didn't confess, or confessed it once, then kept doing it anyway. You start to notice how this shapes the psyche. Even when no one's watching, you pause, you hesitate. The body becomes something suspect or something to be monitored and corrected. The act of pleasure, of self-knowing, becomes tangled in dread. And dread, as you've learned by now, is the church's favourite bedtime story. And yet, in spite of it all, the sin continues, quietly, secretly. The monk behind closed doors, the peasant boy under hayloft shadows, the newlywed wife staring at the ceiling, wondering why God gave her this body if she's not allowed to feel it. The church can write all the manuals it wants. It can preach, punish, even terrify, but it can't unmake human nature. And in the silence of a cold, fireless night, someone, somewhere, reaches for comfort. It's sometime in late autumn, and you find yourself helping repair a wall at the local monastery, mud, stone, sweat, and silence. The brothers don't talk much except when they chant, but one thing becomes crystal clear. They live by the book, and not just the book, but a whole forest of them. Handwritten manuals, thick with ink and ironclad rules. You sneak a glance at one while fetching tools for the scriptorium and spot a title so long it could be its own sermon. It's a penitential, of course. And this one isn't just about prayer or fasting, it's about you. Specifically, what you do when you do it, and who you do it with, or don't. It turns out monasteries were the early adopters of the sexual regulation game. Long before these rules trickled down to everyday folks, monks were drawing up elaborate behavioural flowcharts for themselves and their flocks. These weren't vague spiritual suggestions. They were line-by-line protocols. Some of the most famous come from the Irish and Anglo-Saxon churches, which produced penitentials so specific they read like a very uncomfortable FAQ. Flip through one and you'll see entries like, if a man has intercourse with his wife during her menstrual period, let him fast for 20 days. If during Lent, 40 days. If on a Sunday, 30. If during both, 60. It's like a medieval math problem, and you thought your relationship was complicated. The rules are staggeringly granular. There's one for sex on feast days, one for sex on fast days, one for if the woman is pregnant, another for if she isn't, one for if she's on her period, one for if you just ate meat, one for if you've already had sex that week. It's as if someone decided to take every possible scenario, no matter how improbable, and create a corresponding punishment like it was part of some cosmic loyalty program. Sin 3 times, and get a free heresy accusation. You ask one of the younger monks about it, Brother Thomas, barely 22 and still red in the ears when someone mentions the Song of Songs. He tells you they study these texts regularly, not just for personal discipline, but to prepare for their future roles as confessors. He says it with all the enthusiasm of someone reciting crop yield numbers, but there's a flicker of discomfort when he mentions certain categories, particularly the parts that detail unnatural acts and solo sin. And that's where things get even weirder. Some of these monastic manuals make claims that would earn side eyes even in the Middle Ages. There's a 10th century treatise that claims sex in the wrong position, yes, position, was inherently sinful. Not just embarrassing, sinful. Natural congress, it says, must occur face to face and in silence, preferably under blankets, ideally with no enjoyment. That last part's implied, but very much there. Apparently, if you so much as cracked a smile or moaned, you were veering dangerously close to damnation. Pleasure wasn't the problem exactly. It was the fact that it made you forget your mortality, that it lifted your soul away from prayer, that it made you feel good in a world designed, according to some monks, to remind you of sin and suffering. One fringe rule you stumble upon, possibly apocryphal but delightfully bizarre, warns that couples who couple while standing up are more likely to give birth to thieves. No explanation, no logic. Just a warning that upright intimacy breeds moral degeneracy. You make a mental note never to try it in a field, or at least not near a monk. Historians debate whether these manuals were practical guides or just monastic brain dumps. Extreme moral wish lists meant more for spiritual elite than everyday folk. Some scholars argue they were overblown, never meant for universal enforcement. Others believe these rules were enforced, and the manuals served as training tools for confession and ecclesiastical courts. There's no consensus, only scribbled margins, copies on vellum, and the haunted eyes of young confessors in training. But what's undeniable is that these rulebooks filtered down. They didn't stay cloistered forever. As monasteries educated the clergy, and clergy guided the laity, the rules seeped out. They became sermons, confessional questions, marital expectations. What began as niche monastic practice slowly ossified into social expectation, especially in rural towns where the priest was not just your religious authority, but your only access to knowledge, justice, and penance. You begin to realize the trap that was laid. The monks weren't trying to ruin anyone's life, they were trying to live holy ones, but their ideas of holiness were based on the denial of pleasure, the sanctification of suffering, the view that the body was a vessel to be subdued, not celebrated. And when that worldview gets exported to the general population, things start to unravel. You meet a widow in your village who confesses, after some wine loosens her tongue, that she hasn't known physical touch in over a decade, not since her husband died. She says she doesn't dare think of remarriage. Her priest discourages it. He says her time now is for prayer, not passion. But she misses warmth, misses being held, misses the part of herself she was told to bury. Then there's the young couple who come to you in whispers, asking if it's a sin that they laugh during intimacy, that they kiss each other's backs, that they sometimes talk afterward instead of praying. You don't know what to say, because technically, according to the old rule books, yes. But according to your gut, your very human instincts, absolutely not. And that's where the quiet rebellion starts, not with dramatic heresies or fiery protests, but with giggles under blankets, with stolen touches, with someone choosing to hold their partner instead of lighting a candle. The monastery walls may be thick, but human desire always finds the cracks. By the end of the week, your muscles ache from hauling stone and mortar, but it's nothing compared to the mental weight of those monastic texts. The sheer volume of rules, so meticulous and joyless, starts to make you laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it's absurd. Because the idea that holiness requires a spreadsheet of forbidden positions and prohibited Wednesdays feels more like spiritual micromanagement than divine wisdom. And as you leave the monastery gates, the bell tolling behind you, you realise something important. The rules might have started in places like this, but they didn't end there. They followed people home, into their beds, into their marriages, and for many, into their guilt. It's a rainy evening when you first hear the phrase demon baby. You're half listening to two elderly women whisper near the well, huddled under a shared shawl, trading a story with that gleeful horror reserved for ghost tales and scandals. A neighbour's daughter, they say, gave birth to a baby with a curled foot and a squinting eye, and wouldn't you know it, she and her husband had conceived the child during a forbidden Holy Week. The timing added up. The child, they murmured, was marked, not by chance or heredity, but by sin, conceived in darkness, shaped by disobedience. You want to laugh, but you don't, because you've heard stories like this before, not just in whispers, but from pulpits, in penance books, in the heavy sighs of new mothers holding perfectly healthy babies, but still glancing over their shoulders, wondering if that faint rash or odd birthmark is a divine rebuke. Welcome to one of the most unsettling chapters of church-imposed shame. The superstitious fear that sex during unclean times wouldn't just stain your soul, it could warp your unborn child. It starts, like most things in this world, with fear dressed up as theology. The church taught that the act of sex wasn't sinful within marriage, but only under very specific conditions. That list of conditions, of course, was as long and flexible as a priest's sleeve, and one of the core ideas nestled in this spiritual labyrinth was that your state of soul at the moment of conception directly affected the child. Impure act, impure outcome. Now, medically speaking, medieval people had creative ideas about reproduction. The body was understood through the lens of humours, those four magical fluids that allegedly governed health, personality, and fate. Sperm and womb were mysterious alchemies. Conception was a holy fusion. And so, logically, if the act of conception was corrupted, by lust, by timing, by wrong thoughts, then the result would be a corrupted child. You find an old monk's commentary in the scriptorium that outlines this belief with terrifying precision. He writes that children conceived during Lent are more prone to illness and melancholy. Advent conceptions yield liars and thieves, and heaven forbid a couple be intimate on a feast day. Such a union might produce a heretic. The idea wasn't fringe. It was echoed by preachers, scholars, even physicians. One claimed that evil spirits lingered in the air during certain days, and that to lie with your spouse during those times was to invite spiritual infestation. So much for romance. One particularly strange superstition you encounter in a local chronicle says that if a man and woman conceive during a thunderstorm, especially on a feast day, the child might be born with animal features. You look sceptical until someone swears they once saw a baby with goat-like pupils, probably cataracts, or fear, or the terrifying power of a well-placed rumour. But here's the catch. These beliefs weren't just circulating in the shadows, they were reinforced from the pulpit. Sermons described women as portals of spiritual consequence, where good acts could bear saints, and sinful ones could bear monsters. The womb became a moral mirror. Every squirming infant was proof of something, a reward or a rebuke. And of course, this hit women hardest, especially mothers. If a child was born sick or disabled or even just quiet instead of gurgling, the first question wasn't what's wrong, but when was it conceived? Women were expected to carry not just the child, but the full theological weight of their marital calendar. A single night of weakness could haunt them for life. You meet one woman who confesses with tears in her eyes that she conceived during the tail end of Lent because her husband insisted. Their child was stillborn. She's convinced it was her fault, her sin, her punishment. The scholarly debate around all this is split. Some argue that these fears were mostly superstition, village folklore repackaged as divine warning, more pagan than Christian. Others insist it was a natural extension of church doctrine. If sin affects the soul, and the soul enters the body at conception, then of course sin could deform the body too. Theologians like Augustine and Aquinas danced around the idea, never fully endorsing it, but also never denying it. And in a world where theology filled the gaps that medicine couldn't, belief held more sway than proof. The ripple effects of this mindset were everywhere. Midwives, those gatekeepers of medieval childbirth, were often caught between church rules and lived experience. Some refused to assist with births they deemed tainted. Others quietly ignored the rules, too practical to care whether the child was conceived on Ember Wednesday or St. Lucy's Eve. But even the most pragmatic among them had a stash of holy water just in case. You see this belief system infecting everything. Art, literature, even lullabies. One cradle song warns children not to grow like the cursed ones born under moonlight sin. Another tale, told by candlelight, follows a girl born on Easter morning who grows feathers in secret. You try not to laugh, but part of you wonders if people truly believed these things, or just needed a way to explain pain, tragedy, the chaos of reproduction, a malformed limb, a quiet baby, a sudden fever, something to blame. Because God willed it wasn't always a comforting answer. And yet, for all the absurdity, there's a chilling effectiveness to it. These superstitions did what centuries of sermons couldn't. They made people fear desire not just for its moral weight, but for its flesh and blood consequences. It wasn't just your soul at stake, it was your unborn child's life, health, and future. That's a powerful motivator, terrifyingly so. But even here, you see resistance. Not outright defiance, but quiet, stubborn doubt. A woman who says her second child was conceived on All Saints' Day and grew into the kindest man in the village. A man who jokes that if feast day babies were cursed, then he must be a demon himself, twice over. And a midwife who mutters that God doesn't count days, people do. Still, the fear lingers. It nestles in cribs. It clings to blankets. It echoes in the prayers of pregnant women and the long silences of grieving ones. The church may have drawn the line between sin and sex, but it was superstition that etched it into the bones of the next generation. It's not long before you start hearing names whispered with a mixture of reverence and suspicion. Figures who either conquered their desires completely or burned for them openly. Saints and sinners, polar opposites on the medieval sexual spectrum. At one end, you've got the sexless saints, those who renounce their flesh entirely, devoting every waking moment to God, untouched and untouchable. At the other, the so-called heretics, the ones who challenged the church's control, flaunted their desires, and in some cases made very public love to their freedom. Both types fascinate you, but for very different reasons. Let's start with the saints. These weren't just pious folk who happened to live quietly. No, their lives were walking, breathing propaganda for celibacy. You learn about Saint Cecilia, the young Roman bride who told her husband on their wedding night that an angel stood between them with a fiery sword. No consummation for them, just prayer. Then there's St. Agnes, who preferred death to marriage, and St. Lucy, who tore out her own eyes to avoid the gaze of men. Intense? Absolutely. But that's the bar the church loved to set. Complete denial, absolute purity, martyrdom if necessary. You hear about St. Jerome too, that famously cranky church father who called marriage a necessary evil and praised virgins like they were unicorns made of gold. He believed that even in marriage, sex was always tinged with sin. Allowed, sure, but regrettable. As if every child born were a tiny compromise with the devil. And then you come across the real firebrand, St. Catherine of Siena. Not because she lived a quiet life of chastity, which she did, but because she claimed to be married to Christ himself. She wore a wedding ring only she could see, made of his foreskin. Yes, you heard that right. That's not fringe gossip. That's in her own writings. You sit with that detail for a while, and wonder how much of sainthood was simply a willingness to take symbolic celibacy to disturbing, metaphor-heavy extremes. But what's truly odd is how these saints were held up not just as holy, but as models for everyone, even married people. As if to say, sure, you have to have sex, but wouldn't it be better if you didn't? Virginity became a spiritual status symbol, a kind of holiness credit score. Even married couples were encouraged to abstain periodically, especially during fasting seasons, in an effort to imitate the purity of the saints. The church called it continence. You call it being married in name only. Yet while one part of the world was worshipping at the altar of abstinence, another was quietly or loudly pushing back. Enter the rebels, the heretics. The fringe groups and individuals who looked at the church's web of sexual restrictions and said, yeah, no thanks. You stumble across tales of sects like the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a medieval movement that believed the soul could be united directly with God, and that once this happened you were beyond sin. That's right. Sex, lies, meat on Fridays. Go for it. You were spiritually untouchable. Then there were the Cathars, who swung the opposite way. They believed that all flesh was evil, including procreation, and that sex, even in marriage, was a trap. Cathar perfecti refused all bodily pleasure and even food from animals. Meanwhile, in the same era, the Adamites showed up, a group that worshipped nude, believed in free love, and claimed to have returned to the purity of Eden. These movements weren't just theological outliers. They were direct challenges to the Church's authority over the body. The Church's response? Swift and violent. Heretics were burned, their communities scattered, their writings destroyed, but their memory lingered. You hear people mutter about the naked ones in the forest, or the ones who touch each other without guilt. No one says these things too loudly, but they say them. Because even in a world buried in guilt, desire doesn't just vanish, it simmers, it waits. What's funny, in a dark way, is that both extremes, the saints and the rebels, are obsessed with the body. One starves it, the other celebrates it. The Church wanted to elevate the first and erase the second, but they both live side by side in the medieval imagination, and they both tell you something that the rules never do, that people weren't meant to live in the middle. They either tried to become angels or dared to remain fully, gloriously human. You find yourself caught between the two, a little scandalized by the saintly self-denial, a little fascinated by the heretical boldness. You think of your neighbours, your own family, your partner. None of you are saints, but you're not heretics either. You just want to live without a ledger, to touch without trembling, to feel without fear. There's one more story that sticks with you. A woman named Marguerite Porete, burned at the stake in 1310. She wasn't charged with lewd acts or carnal rebellion. She wrote a book, a mystical text called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which claimed that true union with God involved the total surrender of self, including reason, including morality, including sin. She was seen as dangerous not because she preached sex, but because she suggested a kind of spiritual freedom that made all the Church's rules irrelevant. That's the real threat, not pleasure, but autonomy. Scholars still argue whether figures like Marguerite or the Free Spirit believers were misunderstood mystics or genuine anarchists. The truth probably lies somewhere in the blurry middle. But their existence proves something important. The Church never had full control. It tried, it lectured, it punished. But it couldn't silence the saints who dreamed too wildly, or the rebels who loved too freely. So here you are, stuck between Catherine's mystical marriage and the Adamites' joyful nakedness, between fire and fire. The Church says one will burn in hell, the other burns here. If you thought the tension between sin and sex stayed in the church or the confessional, you're in for a rude awakening. Turns out the most contested territory isn't in the monastery, or even in your thoughts. It's in your bedroom. The marriage bed, in medieval theology, isn't a sanctuary of love or comfort. It's a battleground, a place where holiness and desire wrestle under the sheets, night after night. And the Church, oh, it's camped outside the door, listening closely, holding a clipboard. You start to understand that marriage wasn't seen as a mutual bond so much as a spiritual pressure cooker. You're supposed to be married to avoid fornication, not because it's a noble or joyful union. The priest says it plainly, better to marry than to burn. Not exactly the kind of romantic vow you want stitched on a pillow. It's damage control theology. Marriage isn't permission, it's containment. A moral fence around a fire the Church never quite trusts. Inside that fence, the rules still apply. You're told you have a marital debt, a phrase that sounds like something a tax collector might say, but actually means that both husband and wife owe each other sexual access. Denying your spouse can be a sin, so you're trapped in a paradox. You must have sex, but only under the right conditions. You can't want it too much. You can't enjoy it too openly, and you definitely can't treat it like it's, fun. This leads to absurd scenarios. A couple might be encouraged to abstain for spiritual growth, but also told not to frustrate each other to the point of temptation. So you lie there at night, trying to be holy by not initiating, while also trying not to sin by withholding. There's no win here. Just a slow erosion of trust, affection, and normalcy. One evening, after a long day in the fields, you overhear a husband and wife arguing in hushed tones. He wants to be intimate. She says it's a vigil day. He says he doesn't care. She says God does. He accuses her of using the church as a shield. She accuses him of using her body like a tavern. You step away embarrassed, but the moment sticks, because it's not just about tonight. It's about years of guilt and miscommunication soaked into their mattress. This isn't rare. You hear more and more stories like it. A husband who refuses to confess because he doesn't want to admit he pressured his wife. A woman who believes every miscarriage she suffered is divine punishment for one unconfessed night of impurity. Marriages aren't breaking apart. They're being quietly frayed by a spiritual rope burn. And things get stranger when you find out just how many rules were written about what you could and couldn't do in bed. Certain positions, only one is really safe. Anything else is suspect. Talking during sex, sinful. Enjoying it too much, dangerous. Orgasm not timed perfectly with procreation, suspicious. And if either of you were thinking about someone else, especially someone else, congratulations. You've entered the slippery terrain of adultery of the mind. A favourite quote from a 12th century theologian: "Even within marriage, the flame of lust burns impure." He goes on to say that if a husband touches his wife for pleasure, he must confess it. Not because she's wrong, but because his intention was unclean. So, yes, your thoughts count. Even in the dark, even with your spouse. You might be married in body, but your mind is still on trial. One quirky fringe belief you stumble across in a rural parish is that sexual relations on a Sunday can cause your crops to fail. Not because God smites you directly, but because the land itself is offended. The fields, after all, are part of God's creation, and if you defile the Sabbath, the land withdraws its favour. It sounds ridiculous, until your neighbour's barley doesn't sprout that year. He looks at his wife like she's to blame, and she won't meet his eyes. This belief system starts to erode something quiet and essential: intimacy. Not just physical closeness, but emotional vulnerability. You start seeing couples who sleep farther and farther apart, who stop touching entirely unless it's required, who pray separately, eat separately, and eventually live like devout roommates rather than partners. They're following the rules, but the cost is evident in every sigh and sidelong glance. The scholarly debate here is rich and complicated. Some argue that medieval marriage was more affectionate than we give it credit for, that the rules were often ignored, and that many couples managed to carve out warm, loving relationships in spite of the church's influence. Others say that, while love existed, the spiritual framework made it nearly impossible for sexual joy to survive untainted. That even pleasure itself became a source of shame. The truth, as always, probably sits somewhere in the messy middle. You see glimpses of resistance, of course. A pair of newlyweds who sneak away during a saint's feast to spend the night by the river. An older couple who, when asked if they still observe continence, just laugh and pour more wine. A woman who admits, during confession, that she still thinks of her husband the way she did when they were young. She calls it a sin. The priest, to his credit, smiles and tells her it sounds more like love. Not all clerics are doctrinal watchdogs. Some are just tired men who've seen what guilt does to people. Still, the overall mood remains cautious. The marriage bed, far from being a haven, is policed ground. And you can't help but think, what if the church had trusted people a little more? What if it had celebrated desire as a gift, not a threat? What if it had taught that intimacy could be sacred, not because it was limited, but because it was honest, tender, mutual? But those are modern questions, dangerous ones even. So instead you keep your head down, say your prayers, and try to love within the lines, carefully, quietly, as if someone might be listening from behind the door. Somewhere around mid-autumn, when the air gets sharp and the fields go to sleep under frost, you begin to notice something ironic. For all its warnings against excess, the church calendar is full of feasts, saints' days, holy days, church festivals, relic unveilings, harvest thanksgivings, and those special octave periods that stretch a single celebration into 8 days of liturgical leftovers. There's food, drink, candles, singing, and laughter. But you know what there isn't? Sex. not officially anyway. Because while the table might overflow on feast days, the bed is supposed to remain completely untouched. This is the great contradiction. On days when your senses are flooded, mead warming your belly, meat glistening in the firelight, the scent of roasted apples in the air, you're expected to restrain the one desire the church still insists on tightly controlling. Fast or fornicate, but never both. You don't get to indulge in the flesh and the spirit. Pick one. The rationale, of course, comes cloaked in theological language. Feast days commemorate saints and sacred events. They're not just parties, they're spiritual exercises. Even as you're tearing into a goose leg, you're supposed to be meditating on martyrdom. The pleasure of the palate is permitted only as a metaphor for the joy of heaven, and while your stomach gets a pass, your loins do not. You listen to the local priest deliver his feast day homily, full of poetic descriptions of eternal joy and divine love. Then he pivots, smooth as butter, to the dangers of letting celebration slide into carnality. We feast with our mouths, he intones, not with our bodies. You imagine him practicing that line the night before, possibly while gnawing on a pre-sliced pear, feeling extremely holy. What's maddening is how inconsistent this logic feels. Some saints are celebrated with joy, others with solemn fasting. Some feast days prohibit work, some encourage service, and others, surprise, prohibit sex. You start keeping track, mentally sorting days into 3 categories: green, safe, yellow, unclear, and red. Absolutely do not even think about it. Feast days often land squarely in the yellow. It depends on the saint, on the region, on the priest, on whether it's raining. You hear a bizarre local superstition that having sex on the feast of St. Stephen will cause you to lose your hearing. Why? Because Stephen was stoned, someone says, very seriously. You can't tell if it's theology or bad wordplay, but either way it works. No one wants to go deaf for a quick cuddle. Another rulebook claims that sex on any Marian feast day is especially offensive. The logic is that the Virgin Mary represents purity and obedience, so desecrating her festival with lust, however marital, insults her memory. So mark off March 25th, Annunciation, August 15th, Assumption, September 8th, Nativity, and December 8th, Immaculate Conception. 4 red flags scattered inconveniently through the year. Then there are rogation days, which sound festive but are actually processions of prayer and penance for agriculture. You're supposed to walk the fields, recite litanies and avoid indulgence, including your spouse, especially your spouse. It's hard to imagine being in the mood after a 3-mile walk while chanting about plagues and famine, but the rule stands. You start to notice how much energy people spend on timing. One couple plans their togetherness around the liturgical calendar with more precision than they use to sow barley. You overhear them discussing a gap between All Saints and St. Martin's Day. Only a few safe days, but enough for a romantic evening if they don't get caught up in novenas. Another man confesses that he once had sex on a feast day by accident. He hadn't realised it was the feast of St. Margaret. His penance? 40 days without meat, and he really likes meat. This all creates an unexpected result. Feast days become tense, not because people are hungry or overindulged, but because they're so full of enforced boundaries. You're supposed to rejoice, but not too much. Celebrate, but don't let your joy wander into your bedchamber. You begin to realise that the church doesn't just distrust desire, it distrusts pleasure in general. Any pleasure, if left unsupervised, is a gateway drug to sin. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the fiery sermons, despite the handwritten marginalia, in every moralist manuscript, people still do it. Feast days, fast days, saints' days, they still find each other. Maybe it's the wine, maybe it's the joy. Maybe it's just stubborn love in the face of relentless shame. You hear about couples who disappear during festivals, returning with flushed cheeks and no apologies. You hear about babies born precisely 9 months after major holy days, and no one says a word. The church tries to hold the line, but it's like trying to sweep the ocean with a broom. For every rule, there's a workaround. For every sin, a whispered confession. For every sermon, a long glance between spouses who've memorised the loopholes better than the priest has. There's a particularly striking moment when you pass by the festival of St. John the Baptist. The village is lit with candles. Children chase each other with straw torches. And under a tree, away from the firelight, you spot a young couple sitting close, shoulder to shoulder, hands barely touching. Not kissing, not speaking, just sitting. It's nothing, really, but it's everything. In a world where desire is criminalized, even a hand resting on a knee feels like a revolution. Scholars today still debate whether all this was meant to be taken literally or symbolically. Some argue that feast day abstinence was more about setting a spiritual mood than enforcing actual surveillance. Others point to records of penances, public shaming, even excommunications for feast day violations. The truth? It probably varied wildly. But one thing is certain. The more the church tried to script joy, the more people insisted on rewriting their lines. So here you are, drinking spiced wine under a flickering banner, chewing roast lamb while a chorus sings above you. The bells ring, the prayers rise, and behind closed doors someone else is choosing love over law. The feast goes on, above the table and beneath it. You're sweeping out the chapel when you first hear it. A whisper more than a rumour, low and nervous. Like someone repeating a dream they're afraid to claim. They had to do penance, the baker's apprentice says, eyes wide. In public. For what they did. You freeze mid-sweep. You know what he means. Not theft. Not blasphemy. Not even adultery. Just sex. At the wrong time. Between a married couple. And now, apparently, it's everyone's business. It's easy to forget in this quiet medieval village, where most scandal stays behind shutters, that the church didn't just enforce moral rules with private guilt and whispered confession. Sometimes it went full performance art. Penance wasn't always quiet. Sometimes it was theatrical, deliberate, meant not just to reform the sinner, but to warn the onlookers. And nothing puts on a better show than a bit of public shame. You hear more details as the week wears on. A couple had relations on a saint's day. No one says which one, but the implication is it was a big one. A real red letter feast. Their timing was unfortunate, but the real mistake? Bragging about it. Or at least being careless enough to be overheard. The priest found out, and now their penance isn't a few prayers in the confessional. It's sackcloth, ashes, and a very long walk up the aisle at Sunday Mass. In full view of every neighbour, cousin, child, and curious stranger. You show up early that Sunday, because of course you do. Everyone does. No one says it out loud, but the mood is electric. The couple kneels in the back of the church before Mass starts, dressed in coarse grey cloth, barefoot despite the cold. Ash smudged on their foreheads, eyes fixed on the floor. The priest doesn't name their sin, but he doesn't need to. The parish already knows, and everyone's watching. It's not a flogging, no stocks, no blood, but it stings all the same, because shame in this world is a social currency. It sticks to you longer than dirt. And while the couple will be forgiven, eventually, the memory won't go away. Not from them, not from the pews, not from the curious kids whispering through the sermon. And this, you realise, is the real power of public penance. It's not about the act itself, it's about the spectacle. About reminding everyone else that even within marriage, even in your own home, your body isn't yours. It's regulated, liturgically monitored, and if you mess up the timing, the punishment won't just touch your soul. It'll stain your reputation. The weirdest part? This wasn't even rare. Throughout Europe, especially in the High Middle Ages, public penance was a regular occurrence. It wasn't always about sexual sins, but those were common, because they were frequent and because they were messy. Hard to define, easy to accuse. People were often hauled out not just for premarital trysts or adultery, but for impure marital acts, which could mean anything from sex during Lent to using a forbidden position. Some clerics were stricter than others. A visiting friar once made a couple kneel in the town square holding signs that said, "We defiled the holy days." Others were more poetic. One bishop reportedly made penitent couples walk backward through the church to undo the path of sin. In one extreme case, you hear of a woman who was excommunicated for refusing to confess a specific act with her husband. The priest believed it was unnatural. She believed it was private. The church won. A fringe tale reaches your ears from a traveller. A story from a southern town where couples who conceived during a feast were made to name their baby Penance. Probably a myth. But it sticks. You keep imagining classrooms filled with little Penance the second, third and fourths. The scholarly debate here is thick and tangled. Some historians argue that public penance was actually rare, reserved only for repeat offenders or those who refused to confess privately. Others believe it was more common than records show, especially in tightly controlled dioceses, where bishops were trying to assert dominance. Either way, the impact was outsized. One public punishment could shape a community's behaviour for years. And of course, it wasn't just about correction. It was about spectacle, about theatre. Medieval life didn't have newspapers or gossip columns, but it did have church aisles, market days, and village squares. Public penance was a morality play, and you were both actor and audience. You notice how people respond, some with sympathy, a few with quiet nods, as if remembering their own narrow escapes, others with smugness, the kind of satisfaction that only comes from watching someone else fall off a horse you've barely managed to ride yourself. And then there are those who whisper with wide eyes, feeding the rumour mill for weeks. You hear 3 different versions of what the couple supposedly did. Each one gets more graphic. But the truth is simple. They loved each other, at the wrong time, under the wrong stars, during the wrong liturgical moment, and that was enough. There's a darkness to it, yes, but also something pathetically human. The need to control, to watch, to enforce a rule that half the audience has probably broken in secret. You start to wonder how much of this is about holiness, and how much is about power. The church can't inspect every bed, but it can scare you into self-policing, and if you slip, well, then it gets to remind the entire village who's in charge, and yet beneath the shame, you see something else. That couple, they sit side by side at the next mass, they hold hands again a week later, they smile at their children. Whatever humiliation they suffered didn't break them. If anything, it made them quieter, closer, more careful, not about timing, about each other. You leave the chapel that week thinking about how easy it is to break a person in public, but how much harder it is to break what exists in private. The quiet bond, the gentle touch, the sacred part no priest can see. The part the church will never fully own. It sneaks up on you slowly, this creeping dread that starts to follow you into confession. At first, the box feels like a shelter. Small, dark, warm, a rare place of stillness. You kneel, speak softly, wait for the shuffle of robes behind the screen, and for a while, it feels like safety. You say your prayers. You get your penance. You feel clean. But then come the questions, not the expected ones. Not, have you lied? Or, have you stolen? Those are easy, familiar. But the others, those come with pauses, with careful phrasing, with a particular tone. Have you remained continent during the fast? Were you with your spouse on Sunday last? Did you commit any acts not oriented toward conception? You blink. You stall. You wonder if you're supposed to lie now just to make the whole thing stop. But you don't. You try to answer. And as you do, you realize the priest isn't just listening. He's evaluating, cataloguing, deciding what tier of sin you've stepped into. Was it a slip or a pattern? A moment of weakness or, God forbid, a preference? The worst part is that it's also ambiguous. The line between mortal and venial sin is blurry. One priest might assign a few Hail Marys, another might say you need to abstain for the rest of Advent. Still another might hint, gently but unmistakably, that your soul is in danger if you don't take this more seriously. So you start playing mental chess with your own words. How much detail is too much? How little is suspicious? You're not the only one. You hear others talk, quietly, anxiously, about the dread of confession. Not because they've committed terrible acts, but because the questions get too personal, too clinical. A neighbour confides that she was asked to describe her position during intercourse. Another says her confessor scolded her for enjoying herself too much. She's not even sure what that means. She was with her husband. They were married, and it was Tuesday. The manuals don't help. You find one in the rectory left out by accident and flip through it while pretending to dust. It's a confessor's guide, thick and handwritten, full of lists. The questions are mechanical, like instructions for repairing a clock. Did the sinner lie with his spouse during menstruation? Was seed spilled outside the natural vessel? Did they complete the act more than once in one night? That last one stops you. You read it again, hoping it's a mistranslation. It's not. You realize these priests are trained not just to forgive, but to interrogate, to become spiritual auditors of your most private moments. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's well-meaning, even awkward. But the result is the same, a slow erosion of trust, of joy, of the simple freedom to love your spouse without needing a post-game confession. One fringe story circulates about a priest who made couples confess together, face to face, so they couldn't hide their mutual transgressions. It didn't go well. One woman fainted. Another man refused and was excommunicated. The practice was never repeated. But the legend lingers, proof of how far the system could push. The debate among scholars is fierce. Some say these confessions were intended to guide, not shame, that the church was trying to help people keep their vows and navigate a confusing world. Others argue that confession became a tool of sexual control, especially once it expanded from public penance into private ritual around the 13th century. Before that, sins were handled communally, in big dramatic gestures. Now you confess quietly, regularly, sometimes weekly. It's intimacy weaponized. And here's where it gets darker. There were priests who abused this system. You hear stories, some whispered, some written in dusty court records, about confessors who asked inappropriate questions not for spiritual reasons but for personal ones, who used the secrecy of the confessional to probe, humiliate, or even coerce. It's not the norm, but it's not rare either, and it changes how people think about those little wooden boxes. So people adapt. They learn to speak in code, to confess just enough, to phrase their sins in generic terms that tick the required boxes without inviting too many follow-ups. You hear someone say they failed in temperance with my spouse, and the priest nods. That's the phrase now. It means anything, everything. It's safer. But what about those who don't confess, who don't want to, who don't think they've sinned just because they laughed in bed or kissed on a fast day? They walk around with the weight of it anyway. Because in this world, silence doesn't equal innocence. It equals suspense, a delay in your spiritual accounting. And the longer you delay, the more you start to worry about what's accumulating. One woman tells you she confessed something years ago, a single moment during Advent, and the priest reacted so coldly, she's never confessed again. She still prays, still fasts, still attends Mass, but she's never been back inside the box, not once. I don't need his permission to love my husband, she says, and then, more quietly, but I still feel it sometimes, like a shadow. You realise the confessional was never neutral. It was a place of power, of fear, yes, but also control. The church didn't need to be in your bedroom, it just needed to be in your memory, your guilt, your imagination. By turning intimacy into something to report, it ensured that even your happiest moments would carry a trace of shame. But not always. Some priests are kind, some listen more than they speak. One old confessor simply blesses every couple who comes in, murmuring, "You love each other? Good, that's enough." He's rare, but he exists. Still, as you leave the confessional one late afternoon, watching the sun turn the floorboards golden, you feel the weight of something lingering. Not sin, not regret. Just the echo of being asked, again, to justify joy. You've just finished helping the cooper reinforce his wine barrels when a message circulates, subtle at first, and then suddenly everywhere. The bishop is sending an envoy. A man of the cloth, well-educated and sharp-eyed, is making rounds through the parish to ensure spiritual discipline is being upheld. Not just during Mass or confession, mind you, but in every corner of life, including, yes, behind closed doors. They're not saying it outright. But everyone knows. The church has started hiring spies. You first notice the difference in the way people talk. Conversations get shorter, eye contact less frequent. Wives stop speaking freely at the well. Husbands hush their jokes by the fire. People are scanning each other for signs. Who's been visited, who's been questioned, who might have confessed just a little too much last Sunday. It's not mass paranoia, it's strategic fear. You learn quickly that confession isn't the only source of information. The priest knows who attends, who avoids, who lingers a little too long at the market with someone not their spouse. And now, with a fresh set of ears sent by the bishop, every village path feels rigged. The church never had the manpower to monitor everyone, but it didn't need to. All it required was a few trusted informants, pious men and women tasked with gently checking in on their neighbours. Not in an official capacity, of course. That would make it feel too inquisitorial. No, this is framed as pastoral care, concern, a friendly visit, a spiritual checkup. How's your prayer life, they ask. Are you keeping the fast, and the one that always follows sweet as poisoned honey? Are you living chastely? You meet one of these visitors on a damp morning when the fog rolls in low and sticky. She's middle-aged, eyes sharp, voice gentle. You've seen her at mass, always early, always in the front. She compliments your firewood pile, then asks if your spouse has been feeling well. The pause between her sentences is loaded. Then comes the question about Advent, whether you've managed to stay spiritually focused. It can be hard, she says, for couples. Her tone is sympathetic, but her eyes are collecting data. You're careful in your answer. You speak vaguely, use the accepted phrases. We've kept our intentions pure, and we pray for strength during the vigil season. She smiles, nods, moves on, but you feel hollowed out afterward, like you just performed a morality monologue for an audience you didn't audition for. Soon after, you hear of a family down the road being asked to make a special confession session. Nothing public. Not yet. But word spreads. A child overheard something. A servant saw candlelight at an odd hour. Or maybe someone just guessed. Either way, now they're in the system. The moral dragnet has them, and even if they're innocent, or rather, even if they've only sinned respectably, they still have to answer for it. This isn't Inquisition-level stuff. There's no torture, no formal accusations, no inquisitors in black robes. That comes later, in other places, with fire and force. But the seeds are here, in the gossip, in the gentle questioning, in the way people start second-guessing their neighbour's warmth and their own desire. You realise that the church's most powerful enforcement tool isn't punishment, it's community pressure. When everyone's watching everyone else, confession becomes redundant. You start noticing other patterns. A woman who used to wear a red ribbon in her hair suddenly switches to dull brown. A man who laughed freely now keeps to himself. You hear of a young couple who sold their mattress and now sleep on straw, voluntarily, as an act of penitence, or maybe preemptive protection. If you remove the temptation, you remove the sin. That's the logic anyway. The worst is the fear it plants in your own home. You and your partner start whispering more often, waiting until late to speak freely, and even then, with unease. One night you reach out just to hold their hand, and pause, not because you're afraid of them, but because you wonder, absurdly, if someone might hear. There's no one outside, no eyes at the window, but that's how well the system works. It doesn't need to be real, just feared. And this wasn't universal. Scholars today debate how widespread these surveillance tactics were. Some argue that only certain zealous dioceses employed lay spies and moral monitors. Others believe that such systems were unofficial but incredibly common, embedded into parish life by years of habit and subtle direction. Like most things in this era, the truth is slippery, but the effect, that's visible. Behavioural records, confession logs, court testimony. The numbers change, but the anxiety remains constant. What's really unnerving is how much of this isn't top-down. The church may have suggested it, but the people implemented it. Wives watching husbands, parents questioning children, parishioners ratting each other out, not always out of cruelty, but out of real belief. They thought they were protecting souls, stopping sin before it took root. They were guarding the village from damnation, one awkward question at a time. A fringe story emerges from a neighbouring town. An especially strict bishop had allegedly assigned a team of young men, dubbed the Watchers, to patrol neighbourhoods during Lent. Their job was to listen for sounds from within homes that might suggest inappropriate closeness. They were said to carry lanterns and walk in silence. Most think it's just a tale, but one merchant swears his brother saw them, shadowed in the snow, standing still outside a window for nearly an hour. You want to disbelieve, but how do you argue with a system that doesn't show its face? And then one day, it ends as abruptly as it began. The bishop's envoy moves on. The lay monitors fade back into normal life. The tension recedes like a tide. But the damage is done. Trust, once frayed, doesn't stitch itself up so easily. You find yourself hesitating even months later when no one's watching. When you know, rationally, that there's no visit scheduled, no ears at the wall. It's a strange, sour legacy. The church taught you to be afraid of your own flesh. Then it taught you to be afraid of your neighbour's ears. And now, it's taught you to monitor your own soul as if someone else were living in it. But beneath the silence, resistance is growing. Quiet, yes, but alive. A look held too long. A hand not pulled away. A couple who decides this time not to confess. Not because they don't believe, but because they've had enough of being policed for loving each other in the wrong season. By the time the Renaissance begins tiptoeing across Europe, its ideas, art, and heat trailing behind it like candlelight in a dusty hall, you begin to feel something changing. Not loudly, not all at once, but the old grip is loosening. The chain around the body starts to slacken, link by link. People begin looking up, outward, inward, not just to heaven, but to each other. And for the first time in generations, the question isn't, is this allowed? It's, what if it's good? This shift doesn't start in the pulpit, it starts in the study, in the tavern. In sketches and sculptures and dusty translations of ancient Greek philosophers once hidden away by nervous monks. You begin to see the body not as a threat to the soul, but as something worth admiring, worth understanding, worth celebrating, even worth painting. You get your first real glimpse of this while visiting a small city to trade grain. In a wealthy merchant's home, there hangs a strange painting. A woman, partially clothed, reclining with a half smile. Her skin is soft, her gaze direct, her pose utterly unashamed. It's not lurid, it's not crude, it's human, beautiful even. You stare too long, half expecting a priest to burst in and shout something about fire and brimstone, but no one does. The merchant just shrugs. It's Italian, he says, as if that explains everything. And in a way it does. Italy is leading this quiet revolution, not just with art, but with books, philosophy, letters. You hear whispers of people reading Ovid again, the art of love making its way across tavern tables and into bedrooms like contraband scripture. You learn that scholars are translating Plato with a focus not on the soul, but on the passionate friendships that fuel it. Erotic love isn't being condemned, it's being studied. Meanwhile, the church, still powerful, still looming, isn't exactly thrilled, but even it can't ignore the momentum. You hear of bishops commissioning nudes for their private galleries. One cardinal is said to own a sculpture of Venus so detailed it once made a visiting monk weep. Officially, they still preach restraint. But the line between spiritual chastity and cultural appetite is growing blurry, sometimes very blurry. It's during this period that you begin hearing new ideas about marriage, not just as a tool to avoid sin, but as something positive. Sacred, yes, but also romantic. Companionate. Theologians start speaking of mutual love, even mutual desire as compatible with holiness. A revolutionary idea, considering that a century ago, a priest might have lectured you for laughing in bed. You attend a wedding where the sermon doesn't mention sin once. Instead, the priest reads from the Song of Songs, yes, that part of the Bible, with its rich imagery of lips like scarlet thread and thighs like alabaster columns. People blush, but no one gasps. It's not a mistake, it's a signal. Even confession starts to change, slowly. You hear of priests asking fewer questions, of confessions that focus on love, kindness, and intention, rather than technicalities. One friend tells you his confessor said, "If your love is real, and your heart is open, let that guide you." You nearly drop your mug. That's not the language you're used to. That's not the world you grew up in. But this isn't a clean break. It's messy, unpredictable. There are still plenty of hardline voices preaching that the flesh is weak and desire is a doorway to doom. One famous preacher shouts in the town square about the whores of Babylon, accusing women of sin for wearing perfume or silk. He burns mirrors and cosmetics in public bonfires. For a moment you think the old world might reassert itself. And yet, even that bonfire feels theatrical. People watch, yes, but fewer join in. A merchant you know rolls his eyes and mutters, "Let him scream. I'll keep my wife's mirror, thank you." That's the difference now. People don't just fear the moral hammer, they question it. The printing press helps. Suddenly ideas spread like wildfire. Books once restricted to monasteries are copied and sold in cities. You read a pamphlet by an anonymous writer claiming that pleasure within marriage is a gift from God, not a test. You hear about a woman in Florence who published poetry about desire, cloaked in metaphor but unmistakably physical. There are debates, of course, but the key thing is, there are debates. For once, people are allowed to argue about these things without being dragged to the stake. Of course, not all of this is purely progressive. There are missteps, contradictions. The same culture that elevates romantic love also begins to exoticize and objectify. The same philosophers who praise the beauty of the body still write terrible things about women. But the shift is undeniable. The church may still hold the map, But people are drawing new routes. Even the clergy can't keep up. You meet a young priest who openly admits that he struggles with his vows, not just celibacy, but the whole idea that love must be restricted by a liturgical calendar. He sighs and says, "Why would God give us something so joyful only to make it forbidden?" You don't have an answer, but the fact that he's asking, that's new. One quirky fringe group starts holding marriage retreats, where couples are encouraged to spend time alone in prayer, conversation, and quietly hinted intimacy. It's not official, but it's growing. People are craving connection without shame, and some clergy gently are starting to make space for that. Scholars today see this era as a turning point, the beginning of what would eventually become more modern understandings of sexuality, marriage, and the self. It wasn't instant. It wasn't universal, but the Renaissance cracked the shell. It didn't throw away the faith, it reframed it. Suddenly being human wasn't a failing, it was a design feature. You return home one spring evening and see your partner in the fading light, hair loose, face soft with the day's weariness. You remember all the years spent worrying about feast days and fasts, calendars and confessions. And then you realise, maybe you don't need a reason to hold them tonight. Maybe love doesn't need to be scheduled. And for the first time in a long time, you reach out, not in guilt, not in rebellion, but in peace. It's early spring when you hear that a band of pilgrims is passing through town, bound for Canterbury, or Rome, or Santiago de Compostela, depending on which storyteller is bragging the loudest. The entire village buzzes with anticipation. Pilgrims mean news. Pilgrims mean stories. Pilgrims mean half a dozen dusty strangers trailing relics, rosaries, and questionable hygiene into your parish inn. You don't expect much beyond a few shared meals and some tales of divine visions or sprained ankles. But then you overhear two of them arguing. Not about theology, but about positions. Not political positions, bedroom ones. It stops you in your tracks. One of them is carrying what he proudly refers to as the guide, a handwritten little manual bound in cracked leather and passed from hand to hand like a bottle of contraband wine. You're expecting it to be a relic inventory or maybe a saint's life. Instead, it's a collection of diagrams. Pages filled with sketches, crude, not exactly artistic, but unmistakable. Alongside them are notes, quotes, and plenty of speculation about what's licit, what's tolerable, and what's definitely going to get you 40 days on bread and water. You don't ask to see it. You just loiter a bit too long by their fire, pretending to pick your teeth with a twig. They speak in hushed tones, but there's laughter in it too. One of them points at a certain page and says, "That one's only allowed during a solar eclipse." You're 90% sure he's joking, only 90%. The thing is, guides like this weren't unheard of. They weren't church approved, obviously, but they existed. Half curiosity, half protest, these little books represented a kind of underground sexual literacy, because for all the rules the church imposed, when, with whom, on which days, under what conditions, they rarely taught people how to be together. That information had to travel in secret, through gossip, midwives, poems, and apparently wandering pilgrims with illustrated handbooks. Some of the information in these guides is bizarre. One insists that you should never look your spouse in the eye during the act. Another claims that intimacy during a full moon increases the chance of bearing twins. A third suggests that only the missionary position is truly blessed, and anything else is a mockery of creation. Yet, oddly, there's another page that includes something very similar to what modern folks might call spooning. No judgment, just a note. Comfortable after childbirth, avoid during fasts. You're fascinated, not because the sketches are thrilling, they're more anatomical than erotic, but because of what they represent, people thinking for themselves, trying to navigate a sea of contradictions. The church told them when. These guides asked, but what if we already did? How should we do it? How do we live inside the rulebook without suffocating? One of the pilgrims is a woman, older, sharp-eyed and unsentimental. She carries her own version of the guide, hers written in margin notes of a psalter, sandwiched between verses of David's poetry. You catch sight of a line, "Shame is not holiness." You want to ask her where she heard it. Maybe she wrote it herself. Pilgrimages were supposed to be acts of penance. Holy journeys made to cleanse the soul and beg forgiveness. But by the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, they'd also become something else. A little chaotic, a little social, a little liberating. Away from home, away from the parish priest, away from their own reputations, pilgrims were freer. They walked for God, yes, but they also walked for fresh air, new faces, anonymous sins. The inns along the pilgrimage routes knew the truth. That's why they had double beds. Why they stocked wine. Why some of them quietly looked the other way when pilgrims requested shared rooms. A fringe report from a bishop in northern France complains that many go on pilgrimage not to pray, but to lie with strangers. He might be exaggerating. Then again, maybe not. Even Chaucer, yes, that Chaucer, knew what he was doing when he wrote about pilgrims swapping bawdy stories on their way to Canterbury. His tales, written in the late 14th century, walk that fine line between sanctity and satire. And what they suggest is this, that even the holiest journeys are shaped by the full range of human longing, spiritual, emotional, physical. You sit one evening beside the pilgrims as they share dried apples and ale. One of them mentions a priest they met in Burgundy, who told couples they should pray before, pray after, and be gentle in between. The others laugh, not mockingly, but with warmth. That's a version of faith they can live with. Perhaps that's the heart of it. These pilgrims aren't rebelling against the church. They still pray, still fast, still wear scallop shells on their cloaks, but they're also quietly reclaiming something. A belief that love doesn't have to hide, that pleasure doesn't always need a permission slip, that maybe, just maybe, joy itself is a form of praise. Not everyone agrees. One of the more rigid village clerics refuses to give blessings to pilgrims he suspects of moral deviation. Another warns you not to entertain heresies brought by wanderers. But you've seen the looks on their faces, heard the laughter, read the margin notes, and now you understand something deeper, that movement breeds perspective. When people travel, they carry ideas across borders, and ideas are dangerous things. They don't fast, they don't keep vigil. They climb into heads and linger long after the journey ends. So when the pilgrims leave, you watch them go with a strange blend of hope and envy. They'll return to their lives, their parishes, their confessionals, but they'll carry a little spark with them. A quiet rebellion drawn in ink and passed hand to hand. And that spark, it's spreading. You're kneeling in the garden, fingers stained with dirt, when your neighbour leans over the low wall and asks a question that catches you completely off guard. Do you think God wants us to have more children? It's not an idle inquiry. Her face is serious, tired. You look at the toddler clinging to her skirts, another child playing in the dust beside her, and a third napping under a wool blanket in the shade. She's not asking for theological trivia. She's asking about survival, about fertility, about faith. Because in this strange tangle of medieval morality, family planning isn't just a matter of timing or choice, it's a spiritual tightrope. On one side, the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. On the other, the increasingly tangled web of when, how, and why you're even allowed to be together in the first place. You're told to make children, but only on God's schedule, only with the proper attitude, only without too much pleasure, only if the moon is right and Lent is not. So what happens when a couple doesn't want more children, or can't afford them, or fears what another pregnancy might do to a woman's body already worn thin by childbirth and fasting? That's when things get complicated. That's when theology and desperation begin to wrestle under the cloak of silence. The Church's stance is blunt and unforgiving. Any deliberate effort to prevent conception, be it herbal, behavioural, or even just thinking too hard about it, is condemned. Not just frowned upon, but branded as a sin against nature, against marriage, against God. The purpose of sex, after all, is procreation. Pleasure is a tolerated side effect. Planning, however, that smells like defiance. You hear stories of women who've been scolded by confessors simply for spacing their children too widely, as if their wombs were supposed to function on a divine schedule only the church understood. One woman was reportedly told that her 6th child was born with a clubfoot because she'd withheld herself from her husband too often. The implication was clear. Interfere with God's plan, and he'll interfere with yours. Yet people, being people, adapt. Quietly, carefully. They find ways to work around the unworkable. You begin to hear whispers of herbs steeped in moonlight, of teas made from pennyroyal and rue, of midwives who know more than they let on. Nothing is written. Nothing is spoken aloud in confession, but the knowledge is there, passed from woman to woman, generation to generation. Some of these remedies are harmless, others are risky, even deadly. You hear of one woman who drank a tonic so strong it nearly stopped her heart. She lived, barely. The priest blamed her for playing God. The midwife who gave her the recipe disappeared. And it's not just women making these choices. Men have their methods too. They time things differently, withdraw early. Take long pilgrimages at suspiciously fertile times. One man tells you, a little too proudly, that he and his wife only lie together when the stars are least expectant. You don't ask what that means. You suspect he doesn't know either. The strangest thing is how everyone pretends not to notice. The church preaches one thing, the people live another. A kind of unspoken agreement forms. Don't talk about it, and maybe it doesn't count. Confess your lust, sure, your envy, your gluttony. But not this. Not the choice to wait. Not the fear of a seventh mouth to feed. Not the decision to protect a woman who's already nearly died twice in childbirth. Scholars today wrestle with how widespread these quiet practices were. Some argue that medieval people had no real understanding of conception, that they left everything to chance and prayer. But that underestimates them. These were people who could track moon cycles, predict harvests, and read the signs of animal fertility. They knew their bodies, they knew each other, and they knew when it was dangerous to bring another life into the world. There's a fringe manuscript you see once in a scribe's collection, tucked between sermons and saints' lives. It's simply titled On the Times of the Body. It's not overt. Just a list of moon phases, plant names, and vague comments about cooling the womb or resting the seed. It was likely written by a nun, judging by the careful hand. You doubt the bishop has seen it. You doubt he'd approve. And yet, the deeper irony is that church teaching sometimes wobbled under its own contradictions. You were told to be fruitful, but also to abstain during fasts, feasts, vigils, and after childbirth. You were expected to embrace children as blessings, yet also to avoid sex for reasons ranging from spiritual cleanliness to agricultural superstition. You could find yourself in violation of the moral code whether you conceived or didn't. Some couples simply give up trying to follow the rules. One man you know, older and widowed now, admits that he and his wife used to let nature and mercy sort it out. They prayed, yes, but they also planned. He shrugs. We wanted to love each other without burying more children than we raised. You sit with that sentence for a long time. There's a quiet kind of resistance in these choices. Not the loud rebellion of heretics, but something softer, domestic, strategic. Wives who claim headaches on feast days, husbands who fall asleep early during fertile windows, couples who schedule affection just after confession, when the soul is clean but the womb less likely. It's not theology, it's survival. And slowly, over time, even some clergy begin to bend. A kindly priest in a nearby town starts speaking less about the number of children and more about the quality of love. Another simply stops asking questions about timing. What happens in your home is between you and God, he says during confession, a revolutionary sentence disguised as compassion. You think of your neighbour again, of her tired question by the garden wall. You didn't know what to say then, but now you might. Not a theological answer, not a moral stance, just a truth, that love should not be a punishment, that God is not a ledger, and that sometimes choosing not to create life is its own kind of mercy. It's a market day when you first hear it, not shouted, not announced, but slipped into a conversation like a hidden knife. She said no, someone says, shaking their head in disbelief. You lean in, pretending to examine apples, while your ears tune to the real story. A wife from a village just 2 days north refused her husband's request to lie together, and not because it was Lent, or a feast day, or even because she was sick. She just didn't want to. She said no, and held the line. You expect to hear that she was beaten, punished, dragged before a priest. Instead, the conversation trails off into quiet awe. She made him sleep in the barn, someone else mutters, and he did. They nod, not approving exactly, but not condemning either. The tone is part scandal, part admiration. Because what that woman did wasn't just a personal choice. It was a rupture in the accepted order of things. Wives weren't supposed to say no. Medieval marriage was supposed to be a partnership, but in reality it operated more like a holy contract with specific terms, and one of the non-negotiables, the marital debt, that lovely euphemism which meant a wife owed her husband sexual access, and vice versa whenever requested. It was mutual in theory. In practice, the scales tilted heavily toward the husband. His desire was often framed as more urgent, more justified, more natural. Her body? A vessel for duty. And yet, as the decades inch toward the later Middle Ages, you start hearing more and more stories like hers. Women who push back. Not loudly, not with rebellion in the streets, but with refusal in the dark. With cold shoulders, closed doors, headaches that may or may not be real. Some simply wait out the feast days and fasts, stacking excuses like firewood. Others begin using theology as a shield. It is the eve of St. Bridget. I am in prayer. God sees our restraint. For once, the calendar becomes a tool of defense instead of discipline. You speak to a midwife, an older woman with more knowledge in her eyes than any priest dares acknowledge, and she says she's known wives who quietly banded together. They'd share stories, trade warnings, offer strategies. One might warn another that a priest was asking pointed questions in confession. Another might suggest an herbal tincture to dull the edge of desire, when a husband was growing insistent. It's not open rebellion, but it's resistance, patient, tactical, female, and the church? The church didn't like this one bit. You find sermons warning against the sin of marital refusal, equating a wife's denial with spiritual rebellion. Some clerics said it was grounds for annulment. Others taught that a husband could demand the debt even at risk to the wife's health. There's a grotesque story in one penitential about a man who insisted on relations while his wife was gravely ill, and rather than being condemned, he was told to pray, but not to stop. She, after all, had a duty. Her suffering was his temptation. The logic twisted itself like a thorny vine, choking any room for consent. But things were beginning to shift. Theologians of the later Middle Ages started acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, a wife wasn't a walking sacrament dispenser, that perhaps consent wasn't just important, it was necessary. Some thinkers even began to argue that mutual desire enhanced the sanctity of the act. Radical stuff for a church that had long warned that too much pleasure, even between husband and wife, was basically a handshake with the devil. One particularly bold text, anonymous of course, floats the idea that if a woman says no, and the man insists anyway, he sins twice, once in forcing her body, and again in defiling a union meant for mutual grace. You reread that line 3 times. It doesn't sound medieval, it sounds modern. And yet, there it is, ink on parchment. Proof that some were listening, some were learning. Of course, the debate never stayed academic. In towns like yours, ideas filter down slowly, unevenly. One priest might cling to the old ways, declaring that refusal is a violation of divine order. Another might quietly counsel husbands to practice patience and humility. One might tell a weeping woman to submit. Another might ask her gently, "Is your heart at peace?" And not all refusals come from fear or fatigue. Some come from anger, from betrayal. You hear of a woman who locked her husband out for 3 months after he confessed to spending time with another woman during a pilgrimage. She refused to receive him until he made a public act of penance. He did. Marital politics in real time. These acts of defiance ripple through households. They test boundaries, not just between husband and wife, but between marriage and morality, between love and law. Because if a woman can say no, then she's not just a wife, she's a person. A soul with agency, a body with its own liturgical schedule. Of course, not everyone approves. One village elder mutters that if women start saying no whenever they please, the home will fall into chaos. You ask him what kind of home falls apart when a wife is allowed dignity. He doesn't answer. Scholars argue whether these refusals were common or exceptional. Some believe most women simply endured, that the risk, social, physical, spiritual, was too high. Others point to letters, court records, even poetry that hint at a broader undercurrent of resistance. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Many endured, but some fought, and those few lit sparks in the dark. You think of that woman again, the one from 2 days north, the one who said no. You imagine her in her cottage, standing firm as her husband stares at her, confused or angry or maybe just stunned. You wonder if she prayed before doing it, if she cried after, or if she finally slept in peace. Because sometimes rebellion doesn't look like fire or fury. Sometimes it looks like saying "Nas, not tonight," and meaning it. Sometimes it's just silence, stillness, a body no longer afraid to hold its own ground. You're delivering bread to the rectory when you catch a strange sound. Laughter. Honest, unguarded, belly-shaking laughter drifting out from behind the chapel. It's not the sound you expect from a group of clergy. You peek around the corner and find 3 priests, sleeves rolled up, drinking something from a shared flask and swapping stories in low tones. One says something about Brother Stephen and the milkmaid, and the rest nearly fall over cackling. They don't see you, and you're glad. Because in that moment the curtain slips, and what you see underneath isn't sin or scandal, it's hypocrisy wrapped in red and gold. Not all clergy, of course, but enough. Over time, you start hearing more and more stories, quiet ones, whispered through villages and towns, about men of God who aren't quite as chaste, celibate, or self-denying as they pretend to be. Some are harmless, even funny. Others, not so much. And suddenly, the rules they push on everyone else begin to look suspiciously like cages they themselves avoid. They're not just the keepers of morality, they're the ones sneaking in and out of its back door. It starts with rumours. Always rumours. A priest in a neighbouring town keeps a housekeeper who's never seen leaving the rectory except at dawn. A bishop who's fathered 3 children with a widow and pays her in holy relics. A travelling friar caught in a hayloft with a shepherd boy and relocated for reasons of health. You try not to believe everything you hear, but then again, it all fits. Too well. The official story, of course, is that clergy are meant to be celibate. From bishops to parish priests, every man who wears the collar is supposed to live in total chastity, giving himself fully to the church. It's a rule meant to elevate their spiritual focus, to cut ties with earthly distractions. But it's also a relatively recent enforcement, mandated strongly in the 12th century, after generations of married priests and inherited rectories caused all kinds of inheritance headaches for Rome. The rule wasn't just about holiness, it was about control. You hear of one priest who kept his wife hidden for years, passing her off as his widowed sister. They had 2 children, the villagers knew. The bishop eventually found out, but nothing happened. He was valuable. He knew Latin. That was enough. Then there's the parish further south, where the priest fathered children with 2 different women and gave each boy a different saint's name to avoid confusion. The women worked in the rectory garden side by side. You're not sure if they hated each other or just accepted the absurdity. One of them later married a miller, and the priest still baptized her baby. And yet, while the hierarchy might occasionally look the other way, the rules for everyone else stay brutally rigid. You're forbidden to touch your spouse on Sundays, but Father Thomas gets to keep a mistress in the loft above the sacristy. You must confess every flicker of desire, but the priest just has to say 3 Hail Marys and move parishes. The double standard isn't just irritating, it's infuriating and dangerously normal. Of course, not all clergy are hypocrites. You meet a few who are genuinely holy, gentle, wise, modest to a fault. One old priest near the coast lives alone in a stone hut, grows his own food and weeps during Mass. He refuses to pass judgment on couples. Says love is hard enough without adding guilt. You like him, you wish more were like him. But they aren't. Because the structure itself is flawed. Celibacy isn't just a vow, it's an expectation that too often turns into performance. Some clergy try, others fail. Still others never try at all, and the system protects them, as long as they keep the machine running. Preach on Sunday, forgive on Tuesday, deny on Thursday. Rinse and repeat. You find out about clerical brothels. Yes, you heard that right. Entire establishments set up near seminaries serving only priests. One chronicler in the 14th century mentions a town where certain houses of recreation were funded by tithes. Church money, fueling the very pleasures the church condemned. The hypocrisy is so loud it practically sings psalms. There's even a fringe legend, probably exaggerated but still circulating, about a monastery where the abbess kept a secret tunnel to a neighbouring friary. It was called the Passage of Grace. You raise an eyebrow. The name's a bit on the nose. Scholars debate the extent of all this. Some argue that the stories are exaggerated, popular gossip inflamed by resentment or misunderstanding. Others say the problem was systemic, inevitable, that the burden of forced celibacy created a shadow world of quiet indulgence. Most agree on this. The rule was preached far more effectively than it was practiced, and in the end, the damage wasn't just spiritual, it was personal. You meet a woman who was seduced by a young priest when she was barely 16. He promised her marriage, promised absolution, promised secrecy. When she became pregnant, he disappeared. The child died in winter. She hasn't returned to church since. You hear of a monk who begged for release from his vows, not because he lost faith, but because he fell in love with a weaver. He was excommunicated. She was shunned. They moved to a city and started over. You find their story not shameful but brave, honest, human, and all the while the church keeps tightening the bolts on everyone else's chastity. Sermons, confession manuals, penitentials, the pressure never stops. But now you know what happens behind the curtain. The holy men don't always walk the walk. Some don't even try. So the next time a priest thunders from the pulpit about marital abstinence or the evils of pleasure, you watch him carefully. You listen for cracks in his voice, for the rehearsed rhythm of someone reciting rules they don't follow. And you remember, guilt is only effective when it's universal. When it's not, when it's lopsided and weaponized, it becomes a joke, a dangerous one. But the people are starting to laugh less and question more. It's one of those late summer nights when the air hangs heavy and still, not even a breeze to stir the candle flame by your window. You're trying to sleep, but your mind keeps drifting. Not to guilt, not to penance, but to ecstasy. Not the sinful kind, not the confessional kind, but the kind you've heard whispered in strange places lately. Tales of holy men and women who claim they've felt God in their bodies, literally. Mystics who talk about divine union not with abstract metaphors, but with the breathless fervour of someone describing the most intimate moment of their lives. At first, you thought it was poetry, some overindulgent monk waxing lyrical about the soul's ascent. But the more you hear, the more you realise this is something different, something stranger, something a lot more sensual. You first hear the name Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess, healer, composer and mystic, known for her visions and her letters. She writes about the greening power of life, about God as a pulsing light that fills the body. Her descriptions are lush, ecstatic, almost erotic, though cloaked in theological robes. She never claims physical union with the divine, but the imagery, it lingers. Heat, light, filling, merging. Then there's Mechthild of Magdeburg, another mystic woman who writes things no parish priest would dare say aloud. She describes the soul as a bride, yes, classic, but then writes that God kisses the soul, holds her in his arms and presses her to his divine breast. That sounds sweet enough, until she adds that the soul melts in his embrace like wax before the fire. You close the book slowly, heart thudding. That's not just theology, that's something else. And then you find the wildest one of all, Teresa of Avila, Spanish, radiant, canonized, and completely unbothered by propriety. In her autobiography, she writes about being pierced by an angel with a long spear of gold, which entered her heart and left her on fire with great love of God. She describes this divine encounter as both painful and delicious, saying she wanted it never to end. Theologians call it spiritual rapture. You call it a holy orgasm. You laugh quietly to yourself, but only after making sure the door is latched. These women aren't rebels, they're saints, canonized, quoted, their words copied by monks, recited by nuns, preserved in libraries, and yet their experiences read like something from a forbidden text. Their visions don't just transcend the body, they run through it. They aren't fleeing desire, they're channeling it. Which raises the unsettling question, what if the church has been wrong this whole time? What if the body isn't a trap but a conduit? What if physical closeness isn't the enemy of the soul, but one of its clearest languages? The paradox is too glaring to ignore. For centuries the church has told you to suppress the body, to fear its hunger, to treat pleasure with suspicion. But here are saints, whose most profound experiences of God are described in terms so intimate they'd be flagged in any priest's confessional log. and they're not punished. They're celebrated, because they claim their lovers were angels, not men. You see the loophole. If you couch desire in divine terms, if you make your ecstasy spiritual, it suddenly becomes acceptable. Revered even. You don't get burned at the stake, you get canonized. So maybe the problem was never the sensation itself, but its direction. The church doesn't mind pleasure, apparently. It just doesn't want you sharing it with your spouse. And it's not just women. You read about Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who writes of Christ as his beloved, who speaks of divine union with such yearning it feels more like courtship than theology. He talks about the kiss of the mouth in prayer, of a soul ravished by the sweetness of divine love. Again, not erotic in the obvious sense, but emotionally and physically intimate. An affair of the spirit that echoes the affairs of the flesh. The fringe ideas start growing from there. Some mystics claim to have felt actual physical sensations during prayer. Warmth, trembling, even what one calls an internal flood. Others say they levitate during ecstasy. Some enter trances that last hours, even days. You meet a travelling friar who claims to have seen a woman collapse during Mass, weeping with joy. The Holy Spirit, he says reverently. The tavern keeper mutters, more like the holy shiver. Scholars today don't always know what to make of these experiences. Some dismiss them as poetic license, metaphors taken too literally. Others insist they were real, physiological manifestations of intense meditation and belief. Still others whisper about repressed sexuality, sublimated into religious visions, but none of them deny this. The language is sensual, the experience embodied, the desire undeniable. And here's what really gets you. These mystics didn't see their experiences as shameful. They didn't apologize, they didn't lower their voices, they shouted it, sang it, wrote it in gold ink. Because in their eyes, desire wasn't the enemy of holiness, it was the doorway. You start to look at your own experiences differently. The warmth of a hand, the rush of a kiss, the ache that comes not from sin but from love. You think, if the saints can feel ecstasy in prayer, why must I feel guilt in affection? One quiet night, your partner wakes from a dream and reaches for you. No words, just breath and skin and closeness. You hesitate only for a second, and then you let it happen. No calendar, no confession, just love. You imagine St. Teresa smiling somewhere, spear in hand, and maybe, just maybe, God doesn't turn away. Maybe he leans closer. You're stacking firewood outside the church when someone mentions that court is in session. Not the King's Court. No, this is smaller, quieter, and infinitely weirder. It's the ecclesiastical court convened in the back chamber of the bishop's hall, where sins are tried like crimes, and what you did behind closed doors 3 months ago can suddenly become very public business. You stop stacking. You listen. Because once again, someone's been summoned not for theft, not for heresy, not for murder, but for sex. You wander by the hall later that afternoon casually, pretending to check the notice board. There's a list, names, charges. Most are written in that maddening, vague legal Latin, but some bits are unmistakable. Coitus illicituus, actus carnalis, fornicatio in tempore interdicto. One woman is accused of lying with her husband on the feast of St. James. Another man is brought up for impure relations during a vigil. The punishments still pending. You're not surprised. You've heard the stories. The ecclesiastical courts were the church's moral gavel, established to enforce canon law, and while they handled big offences, heresy, blasphemy, clerical misconduct, their docket was often crowded with the small, messy details of people's private lives. Adultery, incest, premarital sex, marital sex in forbidden seasons, even sexual language in public. You could be dragged before a bishop just for telling a lewd joke in a tavern, which, in your village, would put half the population on trial by Wednesday. What really shocks you is how detailed the court records are. You glance through a scribe's ledger once, just once, and find things you didn't expect to see on parchment. Graphic confessions, specific positions, descriptions of timing, setting, even moods. A woman says her husband approached her on a Sunday after Vespers, against her will. A man claims his wife provoked lust with sinful talk. You wonder how they kept a straight face writing this down. But the church kept these records for a reason. They weren't just documenting scandal, they were establishing precedent. These cases became moral law in motion. deciding what was forgivable, what was punishable, and what lay in that murky middle ground where human nature collided with divine expectation. Some trials were quick: confession, contrition, penance. Bread and water, maybe a public apology and a promise to do better. Others dragged on for months. You hear of one case where a couple was accused of repeatedly breaking Lenten abstinence. They denied it. A neighbour testified otherwise, then another neighbour. Then the wife confessed, but claimed it had only happened twice. The husband claimed 4 times. The court split the difference and assigned penance for 3. There's one infamous case in your region involving a woman who gave birth exactly 9 months after Easter. Suspiciously perfect timing. She and her husband insisted the baby came early. A midwife backed their story, but the priest pushed. Eventually they confessed to joining during Holy Week. Their punishment? 40 days of fasting and a public kneeling at the Easter altar. The child, born healthy, grew up under whispers anyway. And yes, sometimes people refused to confess. And when they did, the court got creative. Threats of excommunication, isolation from the community, in rare cases, imprisonment in a monastic cell. The goal wasn't to ruin lives, it was to make obedience more painful to resist than submission. Of course, not all the trials were so serious. One fringe case you hear about involves a young couple fined for singing bawdy songs while ploughing. No actual act, just suggestive lyrics and rhythm. The judge scolded them for stirring lust in the soil. You can't decide if that's nonsense or poetry. But what all these trials share is a kind of performance. You're not just confessing to a priest, you're justifying yourself to an entire system, to scribes, witnesses, judges, sometimes even a small audience. Sex becomes something to explain, something to narrate, something to defend. You wonder what it must feel like to stand there, accused of loving the wrong way or at the wrong time. Not unfaithful, not abusive, just badly timed. To be tried not for hurting someone, but for failing to line up your desire with the liturgical calendar. You imagine the shame, and then the rage. Some of these trials end in quiet. The couple accepts the penance, returns to their pew, tries to forget. Others cause rifts between spouses, between families. You hear of one man who left his wife after she confessed in court to unseemly delight. Not because she sinned, but because she admitted to enjoying it. That was the final blow. Still, there are moments of odd, unexpected mercy. A judge who hears a woman's confession, sees her tears, and simply tells her to light a candle. A scribe who leaves out the more humiliating details. A priest who waves off a minor case with, "Let them love each other. God's not counting Sundays." Historians have pored over these records for decades. Some say they're proof of the Church's obsessive control. Others argue they reflect real attempts to address the complexities of human behaviour. After all, few societies tried to legislate sexual morality as thoroughly as the medieval Church did. But whether you see them as justice or overreach, one thing is certain. These trials left marks on people, on marriages, on communities. You meet a woman once who stood trial for conceiving during Advent. She was barely 20. The case ended with a fine and a period of abstinence. She tells the story flatly, without bitterness, but then softer she adds, "They made me feel dirty, for loving my husband, for wanting a child." And that's the tragedy, isn't it? Not the rule itself, but what it taught people to feel. That love was dangerous, that desire needed paperwork, that even within marriage your soul was on trial every time you touched someone you loved. You leave the court records behind and go home that night quieter than usual, because you realise this isn't just history, it's a mirror. And the people in it look a lot like you. It's the sound that gets you first. Soft, rhythmic chanting undercut by the snap of fabric and the hush of bare feet on stone. You've crept into the back of the abbey late at night, too curious to sleep, drawn by rumours of a penitential rite, for those who broke the fast of the flesh. You expect something quiet, something sombre. Instead, you find theatre. 6 men in sackcloth, heads bowed, walking in a slow spiral toward the altar. A monk leads them in Latin verses, and with each line they whip their own backs, not hard enough to bleed, but enough to sting. This is not just confession, this is spectacle. Welcome to the world of flagellant processions, public acts of penance for private sins. And more often than not, the sins being punished involved sex. You sit in the shadows, heart hammering as you try to make sense of what you're seeing. The monk's voice is steady, almost soothing. The men's movements are choreographed, each crack of the whip landing with the precision of someone who's done this before. And they probably have. This isn't a one-time event, it's a system, a performance of guilt. And the audience, priests, novices, curious onlookers like you, is part of the point. These processions, which began cropping up in the 13th century and exploded during the horrors of the Black Death, were part devotional, part public warning. A message. This is what happens when desire wins. This is what you must do when you fall short. The logic is brutal but familiar. Suffer now so you don't burn later. But as you watch, you start noticing something strange. There's a rhythm to it. Not just in the chant, but in the movement, the breath, the way each penitent tightens his muscles before each lash. It's hard to explain. It doesn't look sexual, of course not, but it does look embodied, almost ritualistic. And that's the tension running through all of this. You're supposed to reject the body by using the body, punish desire by acting it out. You'd heard of these rites before, how some monks self-flagellated to fight temptation, how certain orders encouraged physical pain as a path to purity. But seeing it in person makes it real and uncomfortable. One man cries softly as he whips himself, not from pain, from something else. Shame, maybe, or grief, or relief. You wonder which sin brought him here, a mistress? A forbidden act during a feast? A moment of lust at the wrong hour? The church sanctioned these rituals carefully. Not every diocese approved them, but where they flourished, they became deeply embedded in local piety. You hear about entire towns processing through the streets, men and women alike beating themselves in time to the psalms. You hear of one village where couples who conceived during Lent were made to whip each other under supervision, to purify their union. That one you hope is exaggerated. But not all of it is so distant or dramatic. You know of a small parish that makes couples who confess to marital impurity sit in separate pews for a full season. No eye contact, no conversation, just penance by proximity. And you wonder, is this really about sin, or is it about control? Because if the goal was spiritual reform, surely private confession would suffice. But no, the flagellation must be seen. The fasting must be known. The shame must be shared. It's not just a spiritual reset. It's a social reset, a reminder to everyone watching. Don't step out of line. Don't let your desire rise above your doctrine. Still, some find meaning in it. You speak to one young monk who says self-flagellation helped him feel closer to Christ. When I suffer, he says, I remember his wounds. You nod respectfully. But later you hear him sobbing behind the chapel after evening prayer. You can't help wondering what wound he's really punishing. Then you meet someone who's had enough. A woman who was once made to kneel for 3 Sundays straight because of an improper touch with her fiancé before marriage. She endured it, but she never forgot. They made me feel filthier than the act ever did, she says. I sinned once. They reminded me for a season. She no longer goes to confession. She and her husband pray in the woods instead. Scholars today are divided on how to interpret these penitential displays. Some see them as sincere expressions of remorse and devotion, grim, yes, but heartfelt. Others argue that they reflect a deeply pathological relationship with the body, where guilt becomes addictive and pain is mistaken for progress. A few go further and suggest that some of these rituals had an almost erotic undertone, not intentionally, but through the sheer physicality of it all. There's one fringe document, a traveller's diary from the late 14th century, that describes a flagellation rite in a monastery, where the line between penance and arousal began to blur. The monks didn't just whip themselves, they watched each other. The diary doesn't elaborate, but the implication lingers. You wonder if the church ever realised how many of its rituals walked that razor edge between chastity and fascination. As you slip away from the abbey that night, you feel more confused than convicted. You came seeking understanding, maybe even a little awe. What you found was pain masquerading as piety, and desire punished so intensely it almost looped back into desire again. You can't help but think, if the church hadn't made love so forbidden, would it have needed to invent such extravagant ways to repent? And maybe, just maybe, the greatest penance isn't a whip or a chant or a season of fasting. Maybe it's learning how to forgive yourself for being human, for loving, for wanting, for living in the body you were given not as a curse, but as a gift. You're standing in a dusty bookshop wedged between a butcher and a candlemaker, and what catches your eye isn't a Bible or a book of hours. It's thinner, bound in worn leather, and when you pick it up, your heart does a quiet somersault. The title is plain, On Marital Companionship. Beneath it, smaller, printed in Antwerp, 1521. You open the cover and skim the first paragraph and then the second, and suddenly you realise someone is finally writing about love without fear. The printing press has changed everything. Before this moment, ideas like these only passed from lips to ears, or hid in dusty manuscripts copied painstakingly by candlelight. But now they're multiplying like wildflowers in a spring field. The printing press doesn't just produce books, it produces trouble, it produces freedom. And in this new world of bound pages and black ink, even the church can't keep every door locked. This little book, slightly smudged, a few pages loose, isn't a heretical manifesto. It's soft, reasoned, even gentle. The author, anonymous but clearly educated, argues that love between spouses should be mutual, that pleasure, shared respectfully, is not sinful, that the act of union is sanctified by intention, not calendar. You blink, you reread a sentence twice just to make sure. It's there. What God has made sweet, let no man make sour. That one line rewires something in you, and it's not alone. All across Europe, printers are flooding cities with ideas that challenge centuries of shame. Some are academic treatises, others are poetry, satire, personal letters. A few are scandalous, yes, but many are sincere attempts to bring warmth and reason to the rules that govern the human body. You hear about Erasmus, who writes in elegant Latin about education, peace, and yes, even marriage. He dares to suggest that it is better for priests to marry than to fall into hypocrisy. You hear whispers of Martin Luther, that firebrand in Germany, not just questioning indulgences but defending the sanctity of sex in marriage. He marries a former nun, no less, and their letters are full of teasing, affection, and very unmonastic chemistry. Suddenly, theology isn't just about sin and salvation, it's about the home, about the bed, about laughter and struggle and flesh. And thanks to the printing press, these ideas aren't locked behind monastery doors. They're reaching shoemakers, milkmaids, and maybe even the occasional parish priest who reads them in secret after dark. You start seeing printed tracts in taverns, love poems in the margins of calendars, illustrated books, some clumsy, some elegant, that discuss the body not as a threat but as a marvel. Not just function, but beauty. You flip through one that explains fertility with diagrams of seeds, cycles, and stars. It's weirdly fascinating, not scandalous, just helpful. The church, of course, tries to fight back. Bans are issued, printers are arrested, books are burned, but the flood has already begun. And the more the church clamps down, the more people wonder, why are they so afraid of us knowing? Some clergy embrace the new wave. You meet a young curate who carries a small book of humanist essays in his robe. He lends it to you for one night only, saying, "Don't tell the archdeacon." In it, you read a passage that stays with you for weeks. To know your spouse in body is to know the mystery of creation. You copy it into your journal, but not everyone is celebrating. You hear of a bookseller fined for importing blasphemous diagrams. Another is whipped publicly for selling a pamphlet titled The Holy Bedchamber. You manage to find a copy. It's hardly lurid, mostly practical advice for couples trying to balance church law with real life. Still, its mere existence is considered subversive, not because it's wrong, but because it's different. And sometimes, the backlash turns violent. One printer in Florence is found dead in an alley, a pile of singed pamphlets nearby. No one's charged, everyone understands. Still, the ideas keep moving. One fringe book makes its way into your hands through a friend of a friend. It's handwritten, not printed, and it's been passed around so many times the ink has faded in places. It's a collection of testimonials. Real people, wives, husbands, widows, writing about their experiences with the church's teachings on sex. Some are heartbreaking. A woman who was told by her confessor to abstain from her husband for the rest of Lent, even though he was going to war the next day. A man who confessed to enjoying intimacy and was told to sleep on the floor for a month. But there are joyful ones too. A couple who found a priest willing to bless their union on a feast day. A midwife who taught women how to track their cycles without shame. These stories aren't doctrine, they're survival. You realize the printed word is doing something the pulpit never could. It's creating conversation, debate, resistance, hope. It's pulling people out of isolation and letting them know they're not the only ones asking, is this really what God wants? You think back to the early years, when even thinking about breaking a fast day rule filled you with dread. Now, you hold books in your hands that say not only is your desire natural, it's good. Not something to hide, something to honour. You walk past a church bulletin one morning and see a pamphlet tucked into the side, half hidden beneath a notice about rosary meetings. You pull it out. On the front it says, Love Without Fear, a reflection on Song of Songs. No author, no printing mark. But someone put it there. Someone printed it. Someone chose that passage from Scripture, the one they've been trying to sideline for centuries, and offered it back to the people. You take it home and read it aloud that night. The verses spill over you like warm oil. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Your love is better than wine. You and your partner look at each other grinning like children who've gotten away with something. Only you haven't gotten away with anything. You've simply found a truth that was buried for too long, under layers of fear, control, and silence. And thanks to ink and paper, it's spreading faster than any bishop can stop it. The first time you hear the word reform, it doesn't sound like much. Just another pulpit flourish, another bishop's proclamation, another word thrown around to make things sound important. But then the reform keeps coming. From Rome, from Wittenberg, from Geneva, from pulpits and pamphlets, from kings and rebels. Suddenly the word isn't just talk, it's a wave. And you, like everyone else, are standing on the shore trying to decide whether to brace for it or ride it. The church, once a towering oak with roots sunk deep into every aspect of your life, your meals, your marriage, your bedroom, is splintering. Some call it reformation, others rebellion. But the meaning is clear. Authority is no longer absolute. The calendar of your desires no longer belongs solely to Rome. Martin Luther starts it, or so the story goes. His 95 theses slam into the door at Wittenberg like a thunderclap. Most of it is about indulgences, yes, but underneath that is a deeper shake-up. If faith is personal, if grace is not mediated by priests, then what else have we been wrongly told? And from there the questions grow. One of Luther's most revolutionary stances isn't about money or papal bulls, it's about marriage. He argues that celibacy isn't holier than matrimony, that priests should be allowed to marry, that sexual intimacy within marriage isn't just permissible, it's sacred. Sacred. You feel the tectonic plates of a 1,000-year guilt trip shift just slightly under your feet. And then there's John Calvin, tightening things in Geneva, giving the Reformation its more disciplined face. He doesn't preach wild liberty, but even he softens the church's old grip on the bedroom. Marriage is mutual, he says. Spouses owe one another respect, care, and consent. Consent. That word takes on new weight. For centuries you were told to obey, to submit, to suppress. Now you hear that mutual affection isn't weakness, it's strength. Still, the Catholic Church doesn't take this lying down. The Council of Trent fires back with its own declarations, doubling down on the sacrament of marriage, reaffirming celibacy, issuing new catechisms. It's a theological tug-of-war, and your body is the rope. Depending on where you live, your entire understanding of love, sex, and sin shifts within a generation. In Lutheran regions, priests marry and preach about love with a wink. In Catholic ones, enforcement tightens. Confession becomes more probing, penitentials more precise. You even hear of a parish where the priest reads from a list of banned sexual practices during Lent, then warns that God counts even what's imagined. People avoid eye contact for days. But amid the fire and argument, something beautiful begins to grow. In Protestant towns, married clergy set examples for their congregants, not as idealized ascetics, but as real husbands and wives. You attend a sermon where the minister holds his baby while preaching. His wife sits in the front pew nodding along. This wouldn't have happened a generation ago. Now it's a quiet revolution. In Catholic regions, the pressure is greater, but so is the resistance. You meet a group of women who've begun meeting in secret, not to scheme or sin, but to study scripture. They read the Song of Songs aloud and discuss what it means to love someone fully, body and soul. One of them says, "If God is love, then why do they want us afraid of it?" No one answers. No one needs to. Meanwhile, the flood of printed material continues. But now it's not just handbooks and hidden guides. It's official catechisms, marriage manuals, and even devotional texts that dare to acknowledge the tenderness of marital intimacy. One French book meant for newlyweds gently suggests that physical affection is a gift from God, not a temptation from the devil. It doesn't condone excess, but it stops condemning pleasure. There are still debates, of course, endless ones. Is it a sin to lie together during Advent? Does the position matter? Must every act intend procreation? Depending on who you ask, the answers vary wildly. But for the first time in centuries, there's room to ask. And that space, that gap between the old rules and new questions, is where a new moral landscape begins to take shape. You begin to notice changes in how people talk. They're still careful, still guarded. But the edge of fear is duller. One man tells you his wife no longer fasts from him during feast days. "We feast together," he says with a grin. Another says his priest told him, "Love your wife, not just in word, but in every way that brings peace." It's not a doctrinal treatise, but it feels like gospel. Scholars later call this the beginning of domestic moral reform. Not because everyone suddenly becomes progressive, but because the conversation moves home. Away from courtrooms and whipping rituals into kitchens and beds. People begin to see their marriages not as trial zones, but as partnerships. Quiet revolutions take place over warm bread and whispered apologies. The soul stops being separated from the body. The body stops being a battleground. You look back on the centuries behind you, on the bans, the shame, the surveillance, the lashes, the calendar pinned like a trap above every bed, and you feel something rare. Gratitude. Not that it happened, but that it's ending. Of course, not everything is fixed. Guilt doesn't vanish overnight. The church doesn't rewrite its rulebooks with hugs and roses, but a crack has formed in the wall, and through it, light pours in. The light of people writing their own rules. Of couples deciding when and how to love each other. Of priests who whisper grace instead of punishment. Of books passed hand to hand, pages soft with use, saying in 100 ways what the people have long suspected. You're not wicked for wanting closeness. You're not broken for feeling joy in another's touch. You're not sinful just because the date is circled on a holy calendar. You are perhaps exactly what you were made to be. Human, in love, in need of no permission to be whole. So here you are, centuries later, with electric lights instead of candles and phones instead of parchment. You can love who you want, when you want, mostly. No feast day bans, no public lashings, no confessionals lurking like traps in the corner of your conscience. And yet, some of those old echoes still hum beneath the surface, don't they? You've probably felt it now and then. That flicker of shame for wanting too much. That little voice that says intimacy should come with strings, conditions, calendars. It's not just superstition, it's legacy. Centuries of being told your body needed management, that your pleasure needed permission. That desire, unless aimed squarely at reproduction and timed by saints' birthdays, was a fault to confess, not a gift to celebrate. But the tide has turned, slowly, unevenly, but truly. The story you've just walked through, this saga of denial, defiance, and eventual rediscovery, isn't just history. It's proof. Proof that even the most rigid systems can bend, that people, flawed, frightened, faithful people, can find their way back to themselves, through whispers, through rebellion, through quiet courage and messy love. And you've made it to the end of the story, not untouched, but a little more aware, a little more grounded, maybe even a little more kind to the part of you that was never meant to be policed. So tonight, as you turn off your light and settle into your sheets, take a breath. Let the guilt go, let the ancient rules fall away. You don't need a bishop's blessing to feel whole. You don't need a saint's calendar to deserve comfort. You're here, you're human, and that's holy enough.